Coldridge, Wyoming Territory. Winter, 1877. The scream tore from Garrett Sullivan's throat before he could stop it. His body jerked upright in the darkness, hands clawing at phantom wounds. For a moment, the cabin walls were canvas hospital tents. The whistling wind became the moans of dying men, and the moonlight streaming through frosted windows transformed into the sickly glow of battlefield lanterns. "James!" he gasped, reaching forward, as if to grasp someone slipping away. But there was no one there. Just the dying embers in the fireplace, casting long shadows across rough-hewn floors. Just the biting cold of a Wyoming winter, seeping through the log walls of his isolated cabin. Just Garrett, alone with his memories, as he had been for 6 long years. He pressed his palms against his eyes, willing the images away. Lieutenant James Raymond's face wouldn't fade pale beneath a sheen of sweat eyes, pleading as blood bloomed across makeshift operating tables. Garrett's hands, once steady with a scalpel, now trembled as they dropped to his lap. "Damn it!" he muttered, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. Sleep wouldn't return now. It never did, after the nightmares. He struck a match, lit the lamp, and moved to stoke the fire. Outside, snow fell in thick, heavy curtains, the world beyond his windows, a white void. Dawn was hours away, but Garrett knew his day had begun. He filled a basin with water, splashing his face and studying his reflection in the small mirror hanging above it. At 38, his face had weathered into something harder than it once was. Dark hair now threaded with silver at the temples. Blue eyes that had once sparkled with enthusiasm now held the flat, distant look of someone who had seen too much. The face of a man who had left part of himself on a blood-soaked field in Maryland. His supplies were running low. He'd need to make the journey into town soon, something he avoided until absolute necessity demanded it. Trips to Coldridge meant questions, stares, and worst of all, the possibility of recognition. Even after 6 years, someone might remember the doctor who'd arrived in the dead of night, haunted eyes, and a medical bag, his only possessions. He dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, armoring himself against the day. The routine was a comfort boots, laced tight flannel shirt, buttoned woolen coat, secured. The weight of his pocket watch, a familiar pressure against his chest, tucked away where he didn't have to see the inscription, "Sullivan and Raymond, Friends Forever, 1860. As he moved around the cabin checking supplies, Garrett mentally calculated what he needed. Salt, ammunition, coffee, lamp oil, and a payment for Augustus Fletcher, the banker who held the note on his failed investment in the Silver Creek mine. Another reminder that even medicine couldn't protect a man from poor judgment. $200 more, Garrett muttered to himself. 200 more, and I'm clear. But $200 might as well have been 2,000 for a man who rarely charged for his occasional medical services and whose only regular income came from trapping and hunting. As he strapped on his holster, a necessary precaution in these mountains, his eyes drifted to the loose floorboard beneath his bed where he kept his savings. Not enough. Never enough. The sky lightened to a dull gray as Garrett hitched his horse, a sturdy Mustang named General. The irony of naming a horse after a rank he'd declined wasn't lost on him. But the animal was loyal and strong, much like the men Garrett had once commanded and failed. The trail down from his mountain sanctuary wound treacherously through snow-laden pines. General picked his way carefully, breath steaming in the frigid air. Garrett pulled his scarf higher, covering his nose and mouth against the biting cold, his thoughts returning to the nightmare that had woken him. Lieutenant James Raymond, his childhood friend, the boy who'd followed him into swimming holes in Virginia summers, the young man who'd stood beside him at medical school graduation. The officer who'd bled out under Garrett's hands at Antietam while artillery fire shook the ground beneath them. I should have saved him. I could have saved him if I'd been faster. The familiar litany of self-recrimination played through his mind as Coldridge appeared in the valley below, smoke rising from chimneys like ghostly fingers reaching for the heavy sky. The small mining town had seen better days. The silver boom had faded, leaving behind weathered buildings and hard-worn faces. Still, it persisted, clinging to the mountainside with the stubborn determination of those who called it home. Garrett guided General down the main street, nodding curtly to those few souls braving the morning cold. He tied the horse outside the general store, his breath clouding as he paused before entering. Inside waited questions, conversation, the human contact he both craved and dreaded. Just as his hand touched the door, a sharp report cracked the winter stillness. A gunshot followed by shouts from the direction of the saloon. "Stop her! Catch that thief!" Garrett's body reacted before his mind could process what was happening, hand instinctively moving toward his revolver. Down the street, figures emerged from the haze of snowfall, men with guns drawn pursuing something. Someone, a woman, burst around the corner, her coat flapping open despite the cold, dark hair streaming behind her. Blood stained the left shoulder of her dress, spreading slowly across faded blue fabric. Her eyes, wide with terror, locked onto Garrett's for the briefest moment as she raced toward him. "Help me!" she gasped as she collided with him, her body trembling violently against his. "Please, they're going to kill me!" Behind her, the sound of boots crunching through snow grew louder. Leading the pursuit was a face Garrett recognized from wanted posters: Daniel Hayes, a bounty hunter known for bringing in his targets dead more often than alive. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Garrett remembered the poster he'd seen in the saloon last week, a woman's face, a substantial reward offered by a wealthy Southern family. The charge: attempted murder and theft. The bounty, $3,000. Enough to clear his debt and start fresh somewhere else. The woman, she couldn't be older than 26, clutched his coat with blood-stained fingers, her breath coming in desperate gasps. "Please," she whispered. For one terrible moment, Garrett weighed his options. $3,000, freedom from debt, a new start. Then his eyes fell to the spreading crimson stain on her shoulder, and the doctor in him, the part he could never fully bury, made his decision. Without a word, he pulled her around the corner of the building into the narrow alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop. He pressed her against the wall, shielding her with his body, just as Hayes and his men rounded the corner, guns drawn. "Stay still," Garrett murmured, his voice barely audible. "Don't make a sound." The woman nodded her eyes, never leaving his face, as shouts echoed from the street. Hayes's voice carried clearly through the falling snow. "Check every building. She can't have gone far. That reward's mine." Garrett felt the woman's heart hammering against his chest, her breath warm against his neck as they stood frozen in the shadowed alley. Blood from her wound was soaking into his coat now, but he didn't move. Minutes stretched like hours until the sounds of the search moved farther down the street. Only then did he step back slightly, examining her face. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, he could see she was beautiful in a natural, unadorned way. Her eyes were a deep brown, intelligent, and now wary as she watched him. "You're bleeding," he said quietly, glancing at her shoulder. "It's nothing," she replied, though her pallor suggested otherwise. "I'm a doctor, or was." Garrett's voice softened. "That needs attention." She swallowed hard, her gaze darting toward the street. "Why are you helping me? You saw the poster, didn't you?" Garrett didn't answer immediately. Why, indeed? The bounty would solve his problems. Yet here he was, harboring a fugitive, risking everything for a stranger. "I've patched up enough bullet wounds to know the difference between a criminal and someone fighting to stay alive," he finally said. "Can you ride?" She nodded. "I have a cabin, up in the mountains. It's not much, but it's safe." He paused, watching her carefully. "Unless you'd rather take your chances here." The woman studied him, her gaze intense, as if trying to read his soul. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she gave a slight nod. "What's your name?" she asked. "Garrett Sullivan." "Abigail Winters," she replied, wincing as she shifted her weight. "And I didn't kill anyone, Mr. Sullivan, no matter what they say." "I didn't ask," Garrett said, though the question had indeed been forming in his mind. "We need to get you out of town before Hayes circles back." He led her through back alleys to where General was hitched, quickly gathering the supplies he needed from the general store first. The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow at the blood on Garrett's coat, but asked no questions, a trait that made him one of the few people in Coldridge that Garrett could tolerate. With Abigail concealed in his coat and the snow providing cover, Garrett managed to guide them out of town undetected. He helped her onto General, then mounted behind her, supporting her weight, as she leaned back against his chest. Her body was alarmingly cold, her breath becoming shallow. "Stay with me, Miss Winters," he said, urging General forward. "It's a long ride, but I'll get you there." As they ascended the mountain trail, leaving Coldridge behind, Garrett knew he had just made a decision that would change everything. For better or worse remained to be seen. Behind them, unnoticed in the snowfall, a lone figure on horseback watched their departure from the shadows of the pine trees. Dr. Malcolm Hewitt lowered his spectacles, recognition and concern etching deeper lines into his weathered face. He turned his horse toward town, a decision of his own taking shape. The trail to Garrett's cabin wound through dense forest, climbing ever higher into the mountains. Snow fell steadily, erasing their tracks almost as quickly as they were made a blessing, for which Garrett was silently grateful. The woman Abigail had grown quieter as they rode, her body occasionally trembling against his. "Almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't certain she could hear him. The temperature was dropping with the coming dusk, and he could feel the dangerous chill radiating from her. Blood loss and exposure, a lethal combination in these mountains. When the cabin finally came into view, a simple structure of logs and stone nestled against the mountainside relief washed over him. General sensed their destination and quickened his pace toward the small stable attached to the side of the cabin. "Miss Winters," Garrett said more firmly now, "we're here. I need you to stay awake." Abigail stirred slightly. "I'm awake," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Just cold." He dismounted first, then carefully helped her down, supporting most of her weight as her legs threatened to buckle. Inside the stable, he quickly settled General, promising the loyal animal a proper rub-down later. Right now, his patient needed him more. The cabin's interior was cold and dark, but Garrett moved with the familiarity of long habit, settling Abigail in a chair by the fireplace, before lighting lamps and stoking the fire from the morning's embers. Warmth began to seep back into the room as he gathered his medical supplies, instruments kept meticulously clean despite years of disuse. "I need to look at that wound," he said, returning to where she sat, huddled in his coat. "Can you remove your dress, or do you need help?" Abigail's eyes widened slightly, but practical necessity seemed to override any modesty. "Help, please. I can't lift my arm." With clinical precision, Garrett helped her out of the bloodied garment, leaving her in a thin chemise that did little to conceal her form. The bullet had torn through the flesh of her upper arm, missing bone by mere inches. "You're fortunate," he said, examining the wound. "It went clean through. No bullet to extract." "Lucky me," she replied with unexpected dry humor, though her face remained pale. Garrett allowed himself a small smile as he prepared to clean the wound. "This will hurt." "It already hurts," she countered. Then, after a pause, "Why are you doing this?" "You don't know me." Garrett dampened a cloth with whiskey, hesitating before answering. "Let's just say I've seen enough people die. I don't need to see another." He cleaned the wound thoroughly, his hands working with the smooth precision of someone who had performed such procedures countless times. Abigail bit her lip, but made no sound as he stitched the entry and exit wounds closed, her only reaction the occasional sharp intake of breath. "You've been shot before," he observed, not really a question. "What makes you say that?" "Most people scream when getting stitches without laudanum." You barely flinched. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Not shot, but I've had worse than stitches." Garrett nodded, finishing his work in silence. He bandaged her arm with clean linen, then helped her into one of his shirts, comically large on her frame, but clean and warm. "You should eat something," he said, moving to the small stove where he kept a perpetual pot of stew during winter months. "Then rest. Your body needs to recover from the blood loss." Abigail accepted the bowl he offered, though she eyed it cautiously before taking a small bite. Satisfied it wasn't poisoned, a precaution Garrett couldn't fault her for, she began to eat with increasing enthusiasm. "This is good," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. 6 years alone teaches a man to cook, or he starves." Garrett replied, serving himself a portion and sitting across from her. "The fever should set in by morning. I'll prepare willow bark tea to help." Abigail paused, studying him over her bowl. "You really were a doctor." "And still am, I suppose. Just without patience." He avoided her gaze, focusing on his food. "The bedroom's through there. You'll take the bed. I'll sleep here by the fire." "Mr. Sullivan." "Garrett. Garrett," she amended. "I can't take your bed. You've already risked enough by bringing me here." "Doctor's orders," he said firmly. "You need proper rest to heal. The bed's yours until you're well enough to travel." She didn't argue further, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't accustomed to accepting charity. They finished the meal in silence, the crackle of the fire and occasional howl of wind the only sounds in the small cabin. As Garrett cleared their bowls, Abigail's voice came softly from behind him. "They'll be looking for me, you know. Hayes isn't the type to give up easily, especially not with $3,000 at stake." Garrett turned to face her. "Why are they after you?" She hesitated, wariness returning to her eyes. "You said you didn't want to know." "I said I didn't ask. Now I'm asking." He leaned against the rough wooden counter. "If I'm harboring a fugitive, I should at least know the charges." Abigail drew a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I worked for a family in Georgia. The Raymonds." Garrett felt as if the floor had suddenly dropped away beneath his feet. The name struck him like a physical blow, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "I was a teacher for their daughters," she continued, unaware of his shock. "After the war, my father died, and my mother sold our small farm. She arranged for me to work for the Raymonds, a prestigious position," she said. "The family had connections, wealth." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "Vincent Raymond, the son, he took an interest in me. I refused his advances, but he was persistent. One night he cornered me in the library. When I rejected him again, he became violent. There was a struggle. I pushed him away, and he fell against a table, striking his head." "Did you kill him?" Garrett asked quietly. "No." Her response was immediate, vehement. "He was alive when I left, bleeding but conscious, cursing me. I ran because I knew no one would believe my word against his. The next morning, I heard they'd posted a reward for my capture, claiming I'd attacked Vincent unprovoked and stolen a family heirloom, an emerald brooch. Did you steal the brooch? No. It was my mother's, the only thing of value she left me when she died. I was wearing it that night, and Vincent tried to tear it from my dress. Said that payment in kind would do if I wouldn't accept his advances willingly. Her voice hardened. I took nothing that wasn't already mine. Garrett studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but finding none. How long have you been running? 4 months, Abigail replied. I've moved from town to town, taking odd jobs where I could. I thought I was safe here working in the laundry, but someone must have recognized me. The irony wasn't lost on Garrett. Of all the fugitives who could have crossed his path, fate had delivered him the one connected to the family that haunted his nightmares. Get some rest, he said finally. We'll talk more tomorrow. Abigail nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body as she rose. At the bedroom door, she paused. Garrett, thank you. After she'd gone, Garrett sat by the fire, turning his pocket watch over and over in his hands. He didn't need to open it to see the inscription. The words were etched in his memory, as deeply as they were in the silver case, Sullivan and Raymond friends. Forever 1860. Outside, the snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the isolation that had been both his prison and his sanctuary for 6 long years. But now, with Abigail Winters asleep in his bed, that isolation had been breached, and with it, the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past began to crack. Dr. Malcolm Hewitt pulled his coat tighter against the biting cold as he made his way along Coldridge's main street. The commotion from earlier had died down, but whispers followed him like shadows talk of the fugitive woman. The gunshot, the bounty. Small towns fed on such excitement, particularly in the dead of winter, when diversions were few. He pushed open the door to the sheriff's office, stomping snow from his boots. Sheriff Oliver Grant looked up from his desk, spectacles perched on his broad nose. Doc, Grant nodded in greeting. Come to patch up Hayes. He's mighty sore about losing that woman. Actually, Malcolm said, removing his gloves, I came to discuss our mutual acquaintance, Garrett Sullivan. Grant's expression shifted subtly. What about him? I believe he may be harboring the fugitive Hayes is hunting. Malcolm settled into the chair across from the sheriff's desk. I saw them riding out of town together, heading toward his cabin. The sheriff removed his spectacles, pinching the bridge of his nose. That's a serious accusation, Doc. Sullivan keeps to himself, but he's never caused trouble. Even patched up Miller's boy last spring when no one else could help. I'm not saying he's a troublemaker, Malcolm replied carefully, but there's much about Sullivan you don't know. Grant leaned forward, such as... Malcolm hesitated as if weighing how much to reveal. We served together during the war. He was a surgeon, one of the best. But after Antietam, well, he wasn't the same, made questionable decisions. That true for all of us who served, Grant countered. War changes a man. Indeed, Malcolm conceded, but some changes are more concerning than others. Have you ever wondered why a skilled doctor would hide himself away in these mountains, or how he arrived with enough money to purchase land and build a cabin when most veterans could barely afford a meal? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you suggesting? Malcolm stood rebuttoning his coat. Just that perhaps Mr. Sullivan's past deserves a closer look, particularly now that he's involving himself with a fugitive with a substantial bounty on her head. I can't go arresting a man on vague suspicions, Doc. You know that. Of course not. I merely thought you should be informed. Malcolm moved toward the door. After all, it's been, 5 years since that unfortunate business with the Ridgeline Bank. The statute of limitations must be approaching. Grant's head snapped up. You think Sullivan had something to do with that robbery? Malcolm shrugged. I'm only connecting pieces, Sheriff. A man with mysterious funds arrives shortly after a bank robbery. A man with the skills to plan such an operation. A man who now appears to be helping another criminal. He paused. Food for thought, wouldn't you say? With that, he stepped back into the swirling snow, leaving the sheriff to ponder his words. Malcolm's breath clouded in the frigid air as he made his way toward the town's small bank. Augustus Fletcher would be very interested to hear about Sullivan's new house guest, especially with that loan payment coming due. Malcolm had bided his time for years waiting for Sullivan to make a mistake. Now it seemed patience had finally yielded opportunity. As he walked, his mind drifted back to a field hospital at Antietam, to blood-soaked ground and the sound of screaming men. To Garrett Sullivan, standing over an operating table, making an impossible choice that would haunt them both for years to come. Your reckoning is coming, old friend, Malcolm murmured to the empty street. Long overdue. In the distance, a door opened, spilling warm light onto the snow. A young woman stepped out onto the porch of a modest home, her face lined with worry as she scanned the street. Clara Blackwood, the daughter of widow Martha Blackwood, had a certain simple beauty, despite what townsfolk called her slowness. Evening, Clara, Malcolm called, tipping his hat. Isn't it rather cold to be outside? Looking for Ma, the girl replied, her voice carrying the slight slur that marked her speech. She went for medicine. My throat hurts. Malcolm changed direction, approaching the porch. Your mother isn't at the apothecary. I just passed there. Perhaps I could take a look at your throat. I am a doctor after all. Clara hesitated, one hand clutching the doorframe. Ma says wait for her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind if I helped. It's what doctors do. Before Clara could respond, a sharp voice cut through the falling snow. That won't be necessary, doctor. Martha Blackwood emerged from the alley beside the house, a small paper package clutched in her gloved hand. Though in her mid-50s, she stood straight as a pine, her gaze direct and unflinching. Mrs. Blackwood, Malcolm nodded cordially, though tension crept into his smile. I was just offering my services. Clara knows not to admit anyone when I'm gone, Martha replied, mounting the steps to stand beside her daughter. Even doctors. The rebuke was clear, but Malcolm maintained his pleasant demeanor. As you wish, though I must say it seems a waste to trek all the way to the apothecary when a physician lives just down the street. Mr. Everett doesn't charge $3 for a consultation. Martha's tone remained civil, but ice underlined her words. Good evening, doctor. The door closed firmly, leaving Malcolm alone in the swirling snow once more. His smile faded, replaced by a scowl as he continued toward the bank. Martha Blackwood had never made secret her preference for Sullivan's occasional medical assistance over his own practice. Another slight to add to his growing ledger of grievances. Augustus Fletcher was just closing the bank when Malcolm arrived, the portly banker securing the heavy door with an oversized key. Dr. Hewitt, Fletcher greeted him, surprise evident in his jowly face. What brings you out in this weather? Information you might find valuable, Malcolm replied. Regarding your debtor Sullivan. Fletcher's small eyes gleamed with interest. Indeed. Let's discuss this somewhere warmer, shall we? My office has a decent fire and better whiskey. As the two men retreated into the bank's back office, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Coldridge in white. Secrets like the town itself were becoming buried, but not forgotten. Miles away in Garrett Sullivan's cabin, Abigail Winters tossed fitfully in her borrowed bed, the fever Malcolm had predicted beginning to set in, and Garrett himself sat vigilant by the fire, unaware that wheels had already been set in motion that would soon force him to confront the very past he had fled to these mountains to escape. The fever came, as Garrett had predicted, settling into Abigail's body with the insidious grip of infection. By morning, she was burning up, her skin flushed and dry, her breathing shallow. Garrett worked methodically, applying cold compresses to her forehead and neck, brewing strong willow bark tea that he coaxed between her parched lips. "Drink," he urged when she stirred, supporting her head with one hand. "It will help with the fever." Abigail complied, weakly grimacing at the bitter taste. "Tastes terrible," she murmured. "Most effective medicines do," Garrett replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. He'd been awake all night watching for this turn in her condition. Infection was the real killer in gunshot wounds. He'd seen enough men survive the initial trauma, only to succumb to fever days later. The memory of those lost patients drove him now, lending urgency to his careful ministrations. Throughout the day, he barely left her side, checking the wound regularly for signs of increased inflammation, changing the bandages, and ensuring she drank enough water and tea. When she was lucid, he spooned thin broth into her mouth. When delirium took hold, he bathed her face and arms with cool water, speaking in low, soothing tones. "You'll be all right," he said, more to himself than to her. "I won't lose another one." As dusk approached, her fever finally broke, sweat beading on her forehead as her body temperature began to normalize. Garrett felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by the bone-deep exhaustion of sustained vigilance. He slumped in the chair beside the bed, allowing himself to close his eyes for just a moment. A soft touch on his hand startled him awake. Abigail was looking at him, her eyes clearer now, though fatigue still marked her features. "You stayed," she said simply. Garrett straightened immediately, checking her forehead with the back of his hand. "Your fever's broken. How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted with a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to you." "The infection wasn't as severe as it might have been," he said, reverting to clinical assessment to mask his relief. "The bullet wound was clean, which helped. You should continue to improve if you rest properly." "Doctor's orders, doctor's orders," he confirmed, rising to fetch water. "Are you hungry? You should try to eat something." Abigail nodded, pushing herself up against the pillows with a wince. "Yes, please. And perhaps, is there any chance of a bath? I feel—" "Of course," Garrett interrupted, suddenly aware of his oversight. "I'll heat water. It won't be a proper bath, but I can bring a basin and washcloth." "That would be wonderful." He busied himself with preparations, heating water on the stove and gathering clean towels and a fresh shirt for her to wear. There was something deeply familiar about the routine, caring for a patient, anticipating needs, the quiet satisfaction of seeing improvement. It had been years since he'd practiced medicine in any real capacity, yet the rhythms remained embedded in his body's memory. After providing her with the means to wash and change, and ensuring her privacy by remaining firmly on the other side of the closed door, Garrett prepared a more substantial meal than the previous night's stew, cornbread, beans, and salt pork. It wasn't fancy, but it would help restore her strength. When she emerged from the bedroom some time later, there was a marked improvement in her appearance. Her dark hair had been combed and plaited, her face scrubbed clean, and though Garrett's shirt still dwarfed her frame, she'd managed to make it look less like a tent by rolling the sleeves and securing it with what appeared to be a strip torn from her ruined dress. "That smells wonderful," she said, moving carefully to the table. "Simple fare," Garrett replied, setting out plates. "But filling." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the howl of wind outside making the cabin's warmth feel all the more precious. Abigail ate with surprising appetite for someone recently fevered, which Garrett took as a good sign. "Thank you," she said, finally setting down her fork. "Not just for the food, for everything." Most people wouldn't have helped a stranger with a bounty on her head. Garrett regarded her thoughtfully. Most people haven't seen what happens when help is withheld. "You served in the war, didn't you, as a doctor?" He nodded, his expression closing slightly. "Union Army, field surgeon." "That explains it," she said softly. "Explains what? Why you're so good at this. Caring for the wounded, I mean." She gestured to her bandaged arm. "And maybe why you live alone up here, away from everyone." Garrett stood abruptly, gathering the plates. "You should rest more. Your body needs time to heal." Abigail didn't press the issue, though her observant eyes followed him as he moved around the cabin. She was perceptive, a trait that likely served her well as a teacher, but made Garrett uneasy. He was unaccustomed to being read so easily. "I can't stay long," she said as he stoked the fire. "A few days at most. Hayes won't give up that easily, and I won't bring trouble to your door." "Where will you go?" Garrett asked, not turning from the fireplace. "West, I suppose. California, maybe. Somewhere I can start fresh, where no one knows the name Abigail Winters. And if Hayes follows—" She was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll keep running. What choice do I have?" The resignation in her voice stirred something in Garrett, a familiar feeling of helplessness in the face of injustice. He'd felt it, watching men die from wounds that shouldn't have been fatal. Felt it when bureaucracy and politics interfered with saving lives, felt it most keenly when James Raymond bled out under his hands because supplies had been diverted to more important units. "You could clear your name," he suggested. "Find evidence that Vincent Raymond lied." Abigail gave a bitter laugh. "Against a family like the Raymonds, they have judges in their pockets and politicians at their dinner tables. My word against theirs is no contest at all." Garrett finally turned to face her. "Then we'll need to be more creative." "We," she echoed, surprise evident in her voice. Before he could respond, a sound from outside caught his attention, the distant crunch of hooves on snow. Visitors were rare enough that any approach warranted caution. Garrett moved swiftly to the window, peering through frosted glass at the trail below. A solitary figure on horseback was making his way up the path, bundled against the cold. Even at a distance, Garrett recognized the distinctive hat and posture of Dr. Malcolm Hewitt. "Someone's coming," he said, tension seeping into his voice. "Stay inside, away from the windows." "Is it Hayes?" Abigail asked, alarm flashing across her face. "No." Garrett checked that his revolver was loaded. "Worse, it's an old acquaintance." The days that followed established a cautious rhythm in the cabin. After Malcolm's unexpected visit, during which Garrett had managed to conceal Abigail's presence by having her hide in the root cellar, they developed a system of signals and safeguards. One long whistle meant danger approaching. 2 quick knocks on the floor meant all clear. The rifle above the door was kept loaded, and Abigail learned to check sight lines through windows before moving around the cabin. Malcolm's visit had been brief but unsettling. He had claimed to be checking on Garrett after noticing his hasty departure from town, but his eyes had roamed the cabin with too much interest, lingering on the 2 bowls Garrett had forgotten to clear from the table, the woman's boots hastily shoved under a chair. "I worry about you up here alone, Sullivan," Malcolm had said, his concern belied by the calculating gleam in his eyes. "Especially with that bounty hunter stirring up trouble in town. Dangerous men in these mountains these days." "I manage fine," Garrett had replied curtly. "Now, if there's nothing else, I have work to do." Malcolm had left, but Garrett harbored no illusions that the matter was settled. Malcolm Hewitt had never been one to let go of a suspicion easily. Now, a week after Abigail's arrival, Garrett watched as she carefully rewrapped her own bandage, her deft fingers making neat work of the linen strips. Her wound was healing well, the risk of infection past, and her strength returning daily. In that time, they had settled into an unexpectedly comfortable coexistence. "You're becoming quite skilled at that," he observed from where he sat, cleaning his rifle. Abigail smiled a genuine expression that transformed her face. "I had a good teacher, though I admit I never expected wilderness medicine to be part of my education." "Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never anticipated," Garrett replied, running an oiled cloth along the rifle barrel. She finished with the bandage and rolled down her sleeve one of Garrett's old shirts that she'd taken to wearing. In the past days, she had altered several pieces of his clothing to better fit her frame, her sewing skills proving as impressive as her quick mind. "Will you teach me to shoot today?" she asked, nodding toward the rifle. "You promised yesterday." Garrett hesitated. Her arm was still healing, but she was right. He had promised. And if she was to have any chance of surviving on her own, basic self-defense was essential. "All right," he agreed. "But we'll start with the revolver. Less kickback for your injured arm." They bundled up against the cold and ventured outside to a small clearing behind the cabin. The day was clear, the sky a brilliant blue, overhead snow glittering like scattered diamonds in the sunshine. Garrett set up empty cans on a fallen log, then stood behind Abigail, showing her how to hold the revolver. "Keep your arms straight, but not locked," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "Both eyes open. Breathe in, then squeeze the trigger as you exhale. Don't pull, squeeze." Her first shot went wild, the report echoing through the trees. Abigail flinched at the sound, but immediately repositioned herself for another attempt. "Again," she said, determination hardening her features. By the sixth shot, she had managed to graze one of the cans, and by the end of an hour she was hitting targets with reasonable consistency. Garrett found himself impressed by her perseverance and natural aptitude. "You're a quick study," he said as they returned to the cabin. "I've always believed that knowledge is the most valuable currency a person can possess," she replied, her cheeks flushed from cold and exertion. "Especially for a woman. It's why I became a teacher." Inside, as they warmed themselves by the fire, Abigail elaborated on her past. She spoke of her father, a small-time farmer with progressive ideas about education, who had insisted his daughter learn to read and write at a time when many considered such skills unnecessary for women. Of her mother, who had taught her practical skills like sewing and cooking, but also encouraged her love of books. "After father died in the war, everything changed," she said, gazing into the flames. "Mother tried to maintain the farm, but it was too much. When she arranged the position with the Raymonds, it seemed like a blessing. A respectable job teaching their daughters." "How long were you with them?" Garrett asked. "Nearly 2 years. The girls were bright, eager to learn. But Vincent—" She shook her head. "He made his intentions clear early on. When I refused him, he began to make my position difficult. Complaints to his parents about my teaching. Accusations of impropriety. Then came that night in the library." Garrett watched her face, noting the shadows that crossed it when she spoke of Vincent Raymond. What was he like, Vincent? Abigail considered this. Handsome in the conventional way, charming when it suited him. But there was something cold beneath the surface. He was used to getting what he wanted, and when denied, his true nature emerged. She glanced up at Garrett. "Why do you ask?" Garrett hesitated, then shrugged. "Just trying to understand what we're up against." She repeated, a small smile touching her lips. "You keep saying that." I suppose I do. The moment stretched between them filled with unspoken questions and tentative trust. Finally, Abigail broke the silence. Will you teach me more tomorrow? Not just shooting, but other things I might need to know. How to start a fire without matches, how to track, how to— She hesitated. How to survive. Garrett nodded slowly. Yes, I'll teach you what I can. And so began a new phase in their unlikely partnership. Each day, weather permitting, Garrett shared knowledge accumulated through years of solitary mountain living. He showed Abigail how to identify edible plants, how to set simple traps for small game, how to read the weather from cloud patterns and animal behavior. She proved an apt pupil, her quick mind absorbing information eagerly. In return, Abigail brought light into the cabin that had been absent for years. She reorganized his medical supplies, creating a more efficient system. She mended clothes that had been torn and neglected. And most surprisingly to Garrett, she read aloud in the evenings Shakespeare Dickens' Whitman from the small collection of books he'd brought to the mountains, but rarely opened. Her voice, clear and expressive, filled the cabin with worlds beyond their isolated existence. Sometimes Garrett closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him, remembering a time when literature and ideas had been as vital to him as medicine. Remembering evenings spent in debate with James Raymond over philosophy and politics, over art and science, over the future they had imagined for themselves. One evening, after Abigail had finished reading a passage from Leaves of Grass, she closed the book and looked at him curiously. "You never speak of your life before the war," she observed. "Were you always a doctor?" Garrett stared into the fire. "I was born to it, you might say. My father was a physician in Virginia, expected me to follow in his footsteps." "And did you follow willingly, I mean?" "Yes," he admitted. "I loved medicine. The challenge of diagnosis, the satisfaction of healing. I was good at it." "What happened?" she asked softly. "To take you from that to this." Garrett remained silent for so long that Abigail clearly thought he wouldn't answer. She had begun to apologize for prying when he finally spoke. "Antietam happened," he said, his voice low and rough. "The bloodiest day of the war. More men than I could count, more wounded than we could treat. Making choices no doctor should have to make, who to save, who to leave." He fell silent again, the memories pressing in like physical weight. Abigail didn't push, just waited, her presence somehow both unobtrusive and supportive. "I lost someone," he continued finally. "Someone important. Failed them when they needed me most." "I'm sorry," Abigail said simply. "So am I." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but contemplative. Both of them absorbed in their own thoughts. Outside, an owl called its haunting cry echoing through the night. "Why did you help me?" Abigail asked suddenly. "You never really answered before. The truth this time." Garrett looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Because I couldn't bear to fail someone else, to watch another person die when I had the power to help." He hesitated, then added, "And because when I saw you, I didn't see a fugitive. I saw someone fighting to survive against impossible odds. I respect that." Abigail held his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "Thank you for the truth." That night, as Garrett lay on his makeshift bed by the fire, listening to the soft sound of Abigail's breathing from the bedroom, he realized that for the first time in years, the cabin no longer felt like a prison of his own making. Instead, it had become a sanctuary for them both, a place where past wounds might begin to heal, where new strength might be found. It was a dangerous thought. Temporary, he reminded himself. She would leave soon, continue westward, and he would return to his solitude. Yet the idea brought an unexpected pang of regret. Outside, snow began to fall again, wrapping the cabin in a fresh blanket of isolation. But inside, something had changed. A warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire, and everything to do with the woman sleeping in the next room. 2 weeks into Abigail's stay, the weather broke. After days of relentless snowfall, the clouds parted, revealing a sky awash with stars, their brilliance magnified by the crystal-clear mountain air. The temperature dropped further with the clear night, an intense, brittle cold that made the snow creak underfoot and froze breath into white plumes. Garrett had spent the day checking his trap lines, returning with 2 rabbits for their supper. Abigail had proven herself adept in the kitchen, transforming his simple provisions into meals that reminded him of comforts long forgotten. Tonight, she had prepared rabbit stew with dried herbs she'd discovered in his supplies, filling the cabin with aromas that made his stomach growl in anticipation. They ate by lamplight, the windows reflecting their domestic tableau against the darkness outside. Conversation flowed more easily now, the initial wariness between them softened by shared routines and mutual respect. Abigail had a gift for drawing him out, asking questions that invited reflection rather than demanded answers. "Did you always want to live in the mountains?" she asked, breaking off a piece of cornbread. Garrett considered this. "No. Before the war, I had a practice in Philadelphia. I imagined I'd spend my life there treating patients, perhaps teaching at the medical college eventually." "You'd have made a good teacher," Abigail observed. "You have patience, and you explain things clearly." "High praise from a teacher," he replied with a small smile. "Not anymore," she said, a shadow crossing her face. "I doubt I'll ever teach again, not with this bounty hanging over me." "You don't know that. Things change, circumstances change." Abigail's expression suggested she found this unlikely, but she didn't argue. After they finished eating and cleared away the dishes, she surprised him by donning her coat, actually his old coat, which she had taken to wearing. "I'm going outside for a moment," she said, moving toward the door. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "It's below freezing out there." "I know. But the stars?" She gestured toward the window. "I haven't seen stars like that in years. Not since I was a girl on the farm." Without waiting for his response, she slipped outside, leaving Garrett to stare after her. After a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his heavier coat and followed. He found her standing on the small porch, head tilted back, face illuminated by starlight. Her breath clouded around her in the frigid air, but she seemed oblivious to the cold, transfixed by the celestial display above. Garrett paused in the doorway, struck by the image she presented, a solitary figure against the vast backdrop of mountains and sky, somehow both vulnerable and indomitable. In that moment he saw her anew, not as a patient or fugitive, but as a woman of remarkable strength and quiet dignity. He moved to stand beside her, his own gaze lifting to the heavens. The Milky Way stretched across the black expanse, a river of light so dense it seemed almost tangible. Familiar constellations shone with exceptional clarity. Orion, Taurus, the Pleiades, their ancient patterns unchanged by the turmoil of human affairs below. They stood in silence, sharing the spectacle without need for words. The cold was intense, but neither seemed inclined to retreat indoors. Instead, they remained side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, breath mingling in the space between them. Abigail had brought her sketchbook with her, a small leather-bound volume Garrett had noticed her writing in during quiet moments. Now she opened it, a pencil poised over the page, as she attempted to capture the moon nearly full and casting silver light across the snow-covered landscape. "Do you ever wonder," she said finally, her voice soft in the still night, "who we really are when no one is watching?" when all the labels people give us fall away? Garrett considered her question, feeling its weight. I think perhaps that's when we're most ourselves, without pretense or expectation. Abigail nodded, adding details to her sketch. Before all this, I had such clear ideas about who I was, what my life would be. Teacher, daughter, eventually wife and mother, I supposed. Now, those possibilities seem remote. Sometimes I wonder if Abigail Winters even exists anymore, or if she's just a ghost, a memory of someone I used to be. You exist, Garrett said with unexpected firmness. Here, now. Those other roles, they're just facets of who you are, not your entire self. She turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. And who are you, Garrett Sullivan, when no one is watching, when you're not a doctor or a hermit or a war veteran? For once, Garrett didn't deflect or retreat from personal inquiry. Something about the night, the isolation, the strange intimacy of standing beneath an infinite sky made honesty feel not just possible but necessary. I don't know anymore, he admitted. For so long I've defined myself by what I've lost, what I've failed at. I'm not sure what remains beyond that. I see more, Abigail said quietly. I see someone who saved a stranger when it would have been easier not to, who teaches with patience and listens without judgment, who carries burdens silently but hasn't been crushed by them. Garrett felt a tightness in his chest at her words, a constriction that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Perhaps we see in each other what we cannot see in ourselves. A smile touched Abigail's lips, genuine and warm despite the cold. Perhaps. She returned to her drawing, adding the silhouettes of pine trees against the moonlit snow. Garrett watched her hands move across the paper, creating beauty from simple lines and shadows. You're talented, he observed. My father encouraged it, she replied. Said every teacher should be able to illustrate their lessons. I used to dream of starting a school someday, a place where girls could learn more than just household duties, mathematics, science, literature, art. That's still possible. Abigail gave him a sidelong glance. Is it? Sometimes I think dreams are like stars, beautiful to look at, but impossibly distant. Yet people navigate by stars, Garrett countered, find their way home by them. She considered this, then nodded slowly. A nice thought, that dreams might guide us, even if we never quite reach them. They lapsed into comfortable silence once more. Below them, the valley stretched into darkness, the lights of Coldridge just visible as tiny pinpricks in the distance. Up here they existed in a world apart, suspended between earth and sky, between past and future, in a present moment that felt somehow outside of time. Garrett found himself smiling, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face after years of grim solitude. What? Abigail asked, noticing his change of expression. I was just thinking that this is the first time in 6 years I've stood outside at night just to look at stars, not checking traps or hunting or traveling, just looking. And was it worth it? Yes, he said simply. It was. Abigail closed her sketchbook, tucking the pencil into its binding. I should go in before I freeze solid, but thank you for sharing this. As she turned toward the cabin, Garrett impulsively reached out his hand, lightly touching her arm. Abigail. Her name felt significant somehow, as if he were truly addressing her for the first time. Whatever happens next, whoever you become, remember this moment. When you were simply yourself beneath the stars. She held his gaze, her eyes reflecting moonlight. I will, if you will. They returned to the warmth of the cabin, carrying with them something new and fragile, not quite definable, but undeniably changed. As Garrett stoked the fire, he realized that for the first time since Antietam, he had spoken to someone not as a doctor to a patient or a recluse to an intruder, but as one human being to another without barriers or pretense. It was terrifying and exhilarating. Later, as Abigail retired to the bedroom and Garrett settled onto his makeshift bed by the fire, he found himself unable to sleep, his mind still filled with starlight and the quiet exchange on the porch. Outside, an owl called into the night, its lonely cry echoing through the trees. But inside Garrett Sullivan's heart, the loneliness that had been his constant companion for 6 years had begun almost imperceptibly to recede. The nightmare came without warning, more vivid than it had been in months. Garrett was back at Antietam, knee-deep in mud and blood, the air thick with gunpowder and the screams of dying men. Bodies lay everywhere, some still moving, others terrifyingly still. His hands worked frantically, trying to stem bleeding set bones, extract bullets, but for every man he helped, 3 more appeared, their wounds more grievous, their pleas more desperate. "Doctor over here. Help him first, sir, please. Save my brother Doc. He's all my ma's got left." Then James was there, pale and bloody, staring up at him with accusing eyes. "You chose wrong, Garrett. You let me die." "No," Garrett protested, pressing his hands against the gaping wound in James's chest. "I tried. There wasn't enough time, enough supplies. You chose wrong." James repeated, his voice becoming a chorus as other dead men joined in the accusation, their faces blurring together in a grotesque tableau of death and betrayal. Garrett woke with a violent jerk, a shout tearing from his throat before he could suppress it. He sat bolt upright, sweat soaking his shirt, despite the cold, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers that cast long shadows across the floor. For a moment, he couldn't remember where or when he was, the nightmare still clinging to him like a physical presence. A sound from the bedroom doorway made him turn. Abigail stood there, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, concern evident even in the dim light. "Garrett," her voice was soft, tentative. "Are you all right?" He ran a trembling hand over his face, trying to compose himself. "Yes, just a dream. I'm sorry if I woke you." Instead of returning to the bedroom, Abigail moved into the main room, settling on the floor beside him. "It didn't sound like just a dream," she said quietly. Garrett didn't respond, focusing instead on steadying his breathing, on reminding himself that he was in his cabin, that Antietam was 6 years and hundreds of miles away. But the images refused to fade, blood-soaked, ground-torn flesh, James's face contorted in pain. "Sometimes," Abigail said into the silence, "speaking of nightmares diminishes their power." Garrett gave a bitter laugh. "Not these. These only grow stronger with telling. Try me." He looked at her, then really looked, and saw no pity in her eyes, only patient understanding. It struck him suddenly that she too had known fear, had experienced her own nightmares, both sleeping and waking. Perhaps of all people she might understand. "Antietam," he said finally, the word itself feeling like a wound reopened. "The bloodiest single day of the war. Over 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. Abigail nodded, not interrupting, just waiting for him to continue at his own pace. "I was a surgeon with the 71st Pennsylvania. We had set up a field hospital in a farmhouse near the battlefield. All day they brought in the wounded boys, mostly some not old enough to shave their bodies torn apart by cannon fire, bullets, bayonets." Garrett's voice grew distant, his eyes focusing on something Abigail couldn't see. "We worked without stopping, amputating limbs, extracting bullets, stitching what could be stitched, comforting those beyond help." He paused, the memories overwhelming him momentarily. Abigail remained silent, her presence an anchor in the darkness. By afternoon, we were running low on everything: chloroform bandages, even clean water. And still they came. I had to— His voice caught. I had to start deciding who to treat, who had a chance of survival and who didn't. Playing God. That's an impossible position, Abigail said softly. Garrett shook his head. A doctor's job is to save lives. All lives. Not to choose which ones are worth saving. But when you can't save everyone, then you save as many as you can, he interrupted, an edge entering his voice. You don't let your personal feelings influence the decision. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. You lost someone you knew. Garrett's silence was confirmation enough. After a moment, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Lieutenant James Raymond. We grew up together in Virginia. Went to medical school together. He joined the Union Army same day I did, though he took a commission while I remained a civilian surgeon. Abigail's slight intake of breath at the name Raymond didn't escape Garrett's notice, but he pressed on, needing now to release the story that had haunted him for years. Late in the day, James was brought in, chest wound severe. At the same time, they brought in 3 other men with similar injuries. I had supplies enough to give one of them a fighting chance. Garrett's hands clenched into fists. Standard triage dictated that I treat the ones most likely to survive with intervention. James, his wound was the worst. Objectively, his chances were poorest. So you chose to treat the others first, Abigail concluded. I chose to follow protocol, Garrett said, bitterness seeping into every word. To be a good doctor rather than a good friend. And while I was saving a young private from Ohio, James bled out on a table 3 feet away. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with grief and guilt. Garrett expected judgment, or perhaps platitudes, about doing his best under impossible circumstances. Instead, Abigail reached out her hand, finding his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his. You did what you were trained to do, she said simply. What James himself would have done in your place. He died thinking I had abandoned him, Garrett whispered. His last words to me were, I thought we were brothers. Abigail's grip on his hand tightened. He was in pain, afraid. People say things they don't mean in such moments. Or they say exactly what they mean, stripped of pretense by proximity to death. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the occasional pop from the dying fire and the wind outside. Abigail's hand remained in his, warm and steady. Is that why you came here? She finally asked. To punish yourself with isolation. Garrett hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms before, but the accuracy of her assessment struck him like a physical blow. Perhaps, he admitted, though I told myself it was to find peace. And have you found peace? No, he said honestly. Just silence. It's not the same thing. Abigail nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then, surprising him, she shifted closer, her shoulder pressing against his, her body a warm presence in the chilled room. Thank you for telling me. I've never told anyone before, Garrett realized as he spoke the words. Not the full truth. It's a heavy burden to carry alone. Yes. Neither spoke again for some time, sitting side by side in the darkness, hands still joined. Garrett felt something shift within him. Not healing exactly, for the wound of James's death was too deep for simple remedy, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might someday be possible. Eventually, Abigail's head drooped against his shoulder, sleep, reclaiming her despite her attempt to keep him company. Garrett sat unmoving, reluctant to disturb her, finding unexpected comfort in the weight of her against him, in the soft sound of her breathing. When the fire had died to mere embers and the cold began to seep more insistently into the room, he finally moved carefully, lifting her into his arms. She stirred slightly as he carried her back to the bedroom, but didn't wake, murmuring something indistinct as he laid her gently on the bed and pulled the blankets over her. For a moment, he stood watching her sleep, struck by how quickly this woman had come to matter to him, how completely she had disrupted the careful isolation he had constructed. As he returned to his own makeshift bed, Garrett realized that the nightmare's grip had loosened. The images of Antietam remained as they always would, but they had been joined by something else. The memory of Abigail's hand in his, her understanding presence, her acceptance of his darkest truth. For the first time in years, he slept without dreams. Outside the cabin, unnoticed by either of its occupants, a figure on horseback observed the glowing windows from the shelter of the pines. Daniel Hayes pulled his collar higher against the cold, his expression thoughtful as he watched the light finally extinguish. The fugitive was here just as his informant had suggested. Now it was simply a matter of patience and planning. The bounty hunter turned his horse back toward Coldridge, moving quietly through the snow-draped forest. Dawn was hours away, but he had what he needed. Abigail Winters would not elude him a second time. The morning dawned clear, and cold sunlight streaming through frosted windows to cast golden patterns across the cabin floor. Abigail woke slowly, memories of the previous night filtering back Garrett's nightmare, his confession about James Raymond, the quiet intimacy of sitting together in darkness. She had fallen asleep against his shoulder, she recalled, yet had awakened in the bed. He must have carried her. The thought brought warmth to her cheeks as she rose, dressing quickly in the chill air. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found the main room empty, though the fire had been built up and a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove. A note leaned against a cup on the table, written in Garrett's precise hand, "Checking trap lines, back by noon." Abigail poured coffee, wrapping her hands around the cup for warmth, as she took in the quiet solitude of the morning. 3 weeks had passed since Garrett had brought her to this cabin, 3 weeks that had transformed her from a desperate fugitive to, what, not quite a guest anymore, but something undefined, something hovering in the space between necessity and choice. She moved about the cabin, tidying the already orderly space, folding the blankets Garrett had used on his makeshift bed. Her eyes lingered on the medical bag tucked beneath a shelf, its leather worn but well-maintained. Garrett Sullivan was a puzzle, a skilled physician who chose isolation, a man capable of tremendous compassion, who punished himself for a wartime decision any rational person would understand. And now she knew he had a connection to the Raymond family, a connection that predated her own unfortunate entanglement with them. James Raymond Garrett's childhood friend must have been related to Vincent. An uncle, perhaps, or older cousin. The coincidence was unsettling, as if her path and Garrett's had been destined to cross long before either realized it. Sipping her coffee, Abigail's gaze wandered around the cabin, taking in the sparse but functional furnishings, the meticulous organization of supplies, the small shelf of books. It occurred to her that everything in the space reflected Garrett's character. Practical, purposeful, without ornamentation, but solid and dependable. A loose floorboard beneath her foot creaked as she moved toward the fireplace. She paused, noticing how it shifted slightly under her weight. Curious, she knelt and pressed experimentally. The board moved, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Abigail hesitated. This was Garrett's private space, his secrets. Yet after his openness last night, she felt a need to understand him better, to know the man who had risked everything to save her. Before she could reconsider, she lifted the board completely. Inside the small space, lay a wooden box, simple but finely crafted. With careful hands, she removed it and placed it on the table. The lid opened easily, revealing contents that made her breath catch. A folded letter on yellowed paper, its creases worn thin from repeated handling. A military medal, the Union Army's Medal of Honor, its ribbon faded but intact, and a silver pocket watch tarnished with age. Almost reverently, Abigail lifted the watch. It felt heavy in her palm, its case engraved with an intricate pattern of vines. When she opened it, an inscription caught the morning light: Sullivan and Raymond, friends forever, 1860. Inside the lid was a small daguerreotype, two young men in university attire, arms around each other's shoulders, faces bright with the certainty of youth. Garrett, unmistakable, even without the lines that now marked his face, and beside him, a handsome young man, who must be James Raymond. She set the watch aside and carefully unfolded the letter. It was a military communication formally expressing condolences to the family of Lieutenant James Raymond of the 71st Pennsylvania Volunteers killed in action at Antietam. What caught Abigail's eye, however, was the mention of Lieutenant Raymond's surviving family parents, George and Eleanor Raymond of Richmond, Virginia, and younger brother Vincent. Vincent, the same Vincent who had attacked her, who had put a bounty on her head. The connection was undeniable, a twist of fate that seemed almost cruelly orchestrated. Abigail refolded the letter with trembling fingers, suddenly understanding the weight of what Garrett carried. Not just the death of his friend, but an invisible tie to the very family that pursued her. As she returned the items to the box, something else caught her eye, a folded paper tucked into the bottom corner. She hesitated, then drew it out, unfolding what appeared to be a detailed map. It took her a moment to recognize the layout of Coleridge's bank, complete with annotations about guard positions, safe locations, and delivery schedules. Beside it lay a smaller note with dates and times, one circled in bold ink just a week away. Fletcher Transport, $5,000. Abigail stared at the documents, a cold feeling spreading through her chest. Was Garrett planning a bank robbery? The evidence seemed irrefutable. Detailed plans, scheduled dates, specific amounts. Had she been wrong about him? Was the isolated cabin not a sanctuary but the hideout of a criminal? Yet nothing about the compassionate, principled man who had saved her life, who had shared his deepest guilt with her, aligned with the image of a bank robber. There had to be another explanation. Quickly, she returned everything to the box exactly as she had found it, replaced it in the hidden compartment, and repositioned the floorboard. She had just straightened when the cabin door opened, Garrett entering in a swirl of cold air, his coat dusted with snow, two rabbits dangling from his belt. "Good morning," he said, stamping his boots. "Traplines were productive today." Abigail forced a smile, hoping her discovery didn't show on her face. "I see that. Coffee's still hot if you'd like some." He nodded gratefully, shrugging out of his coat and hanging it by the door. As he moved toward the stove, Abigail watched him carefully, searching for any sign of the man those bank plans suggested. All she saw was Garrett, steady, reliable, a man weighted by past regrets, but inherently decent. "I've been thinking," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "It might be wise for you to have proper clothing, something other than my old shirts. I could make a trip to town, see what's available at the mercantile." "That's thoughtful," Abigail replied, "but risky. Hayes might still be watching the town." "Hayes hasn't been seen in Coleridge for days," Garrett said. "According to Ezra Cooper, I ran into him checking his own traps this morning. Ezra keeps his ear to the ground better than most." Ezra Cooper, the blacksmith, one of the few people in town I trust. Fought at Gettysburg, lost 2 fingers to a Confederate bayonet. Doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's worth listening to. Abigail hesitated, the discovery of the bank plans making her wary. "And he's sure Hayes is gone." Rode out 3 days ago heading east. Apparently got word of another bounty worth pursuing. Garrett sipped his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. What's wrong? You seem tense this morning. She couldn't meet his eyes. Just restless, I suppose. It's been 3 weeks and I'm still hiding. Still running. It won't always be this way, Garrett said, his voice gentle. We'll find a solution. She repeated the word, catching in her throat. How could she question his intentions after everything he'd done? Yet the map and notes hidden beneath the floorboard nagged at her conscience. Garrett, why are you really helping me? The truth. He set down his cup, surprise evident in his expression. I told you last night. You told me about James Raymond, about your guilt, but there's more, isn't there? The words tumbled out before she could stop them. You knew the Raymonds. Vincent is James's brother. Garrett went very still, his eyes never leaving her face. How did you know that? Abigail swallowed hard, guilt washing over her. I found your box, under the floorboard. I saw the letter of condolence, the watch. You went through my things. His voice was quiet, but she heard the hurt beneath the words. I'm sorry. The board was loose, and I was curious. I had no right. She took a deep breath, then pressed on. I also saw the bank plans. At this, Garrett's expression changed from hurt to confusion. Bank plans. What are you talking about? The map of Coldridge Bank. The schedule for the money transport. Abigail's voice faltered at his seemingly genuine bewilderment. The papers at the bottom of the box. Understanding dawned in Garrett's eyes, followed by something like relief. Abigail, those aren't plans for a robbery. They're evidence. Evidence. Garrett moved to the loose floorboard, lifting it to retrieve the box. He placed it on the table between them, then extracted the map and schedule she had discovered. 5 years ago, shortly after I arrived here, the Ridgeline Bank in Clearwater was robbed. 2 guards killed. The thieves were never caught. What does that have to do with these papers? I found them in Malcolm Hewitt's office when he treated me for a hunting accident, Garrett explained. He stepped out to fetch more bandages, and I noticed a similar map on his desk. When he returned, he was quick to put it away, but not before I saw what it was. Abigail stared at him, trying to process this information. You think Dr. Hewitt was involved in the robbery? I know he was. He and Augustus Fletcher Coldridge's banker. I've been gathering evidence for years trying to prove their involvement. Garrett ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in the gesture. But in a town this small, accusations against prominent citizens require irrefutable proof, especially from an outsider like me. Relief flooded through Abigail, followed quickly by shame at having doubted him. I'm sorry I suspected you, she said quietly, and sorrier still for invading your privacy. Garrett's expression softened. I should have told you the full truth from the beginning, about my connection to the Raymonds, about Malcolm. He sighed, replacing the papers in the box. When you said you were running from the Raymond family, I could hardly believe it. The coincidence seemed impossible. Do you think it's really coincidence? Abigail asked, or something more like fate? Garrett's lips curved in a sad smile. I stopped believing in that at Antietam. Abigail reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching the back of his hand. Yet, here we are, both running from different parts of the same past, both seeking some kind of redemption. Garrett turned his hand, catching her fingers in his. Perhaps not coincidence then, but I'm not sure I'm ready to call it fate. Their eyes met across the table, something unspoken passing between them, understanding, forgiveness, and something deeper, that neither was prepared to name. The moment stretched, filled with possibility, until a sharp knock at the cabin door shattered the stillness. They froze, hands still joined across the table. No one visited the cabin, no one except Malcolm Hewitt, whose previous visit had left them both wary. Garrett rose silently, moving to the window to peer cautiously outside. His body tensed, and when he turned back to Abigail, his expression was grave. "It's Malcolm," he whispered. "And he's not alone. Sheriff Grant is with him." Abigail moved swiftly to the bedroom as Garrett had taught her, closing the door silently behind her. Through the thin walls, she could hear the creak of the cabin door opening, the stamp of boots, men's voices. "Sullivan," Malcolm's voice carried clearly, a false heartiness underlying his tone. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." "Dr. Hewitt, Sheriff Grant." Garrett's response was controlled, revealing nothing. "This is unexpected." "Just making rounds?" Sheriff Grant replied, his deep voice matter-of-fact. "Heavy snows isolated some of the outlying homesteads. Checking folks have what they need." "I appreciate the concern, but I'm well supplied." "Mind if we warm ourselves a bit?" Malcolm again, already moving further into the cabin, judging by his voice. "Bitter cold out there today." There was a pause, during which Abigail imagined Garrett weighing his limited options. To refuse would only heighten suspicion. "Of course," he finally said. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." "Much obliged," said the sheriff. Abigail held her breath, listening intently to the sounds of men settling cups, clinking chairs, scraping against the wooden floor. Through a small crack in the doorframe, she could just see a portion of the main room, enough to observe Malcolm's calculating gaze as it roamed the cabin, lingering on the 2 cups still on the table. The woman's boots Garrett had hastily kicked beneath a chair. "Place looks different," Malcolm commented. "More lived in somehow." "I've had time on my hands with the heavy snow," Garrett replied evenly. "Done some organizing." Malcolm hummed noncommittally, sipping his coffee. "Been meaning to ask Sullivan heard anything about that woman Hayes was hunting, the one who shot up the saloon before disappearing." "Nothing beyond town gossip," Garrett said. "Why would I?" Sheriff Grant cleared his throat. "Doc Hewitt here seems to think you might be acquainted with the lady. Says he saw you riding out together the day of the incident." Abigail's heart pounded so loudly she was certain they must hear it in the next room. Garrett, however, remained composed. "I rode out alone that day, Sheriff, as I do most days when weather permits. If Malcolm saw differently, his eyesight may be failing him. Perhaps he should consult an ophthalmologist." The jab didn't go unnoticed. Malcolm set his cup down with a sharp clink. "My vision is perfectly sound, Sullivan, just as my memory is clear about certain events 5 years ago." "Malcolm!" The sheriff warned, a note of weariness in his voice, suggesting this wasn't a new conversation. "It's all right, Sheriff," Garrett said calmly. "Dr. Hewitt has long harbored suspicions about me, never with sufficient evidence to warrant action, but persistent nonetheless. It's become something of a hobby for him, I believe." Malcolm's chair scraped back. "You always were skilled at deflection, Sullivan, even at Antietam, when you chose which men to save and which to let die." The air in the cabin seemed to freeze at these words. Abigail pressed a hand to her mouth, understanding the cruelty of the barb, its deliberate targeting of Garrett's deepest wound. "That's enough," Sheriff Grant said firmly. "We came to check on a resident during harsh weather, not to dredge up war stories." "It's relevant, Sheriff," Malcolm insisted. "A man's past actions often predict his future ones. Sullivan here has a history of making calculations that benefit himself at others' expense." "That's not how I remember it." Garrett's voice remained steady, though Abigail could imagine the cost of that control. But then we all see what we choose to see, don't we, Malcolm? Especially when looking in the mirror. A tense silence followed, broken only when the sheriff stood his patience, clearly exhausted. "Well, Sullivan, seems you're managing fine up here. We'll be heading back to town now. Roads'll be worse once the sun starts setting." "Of course," Garrett replied. "Always a pleasure, Sheriff." Boots moved toward the door and then paused. Malcolm's voice came again, deceptively casual. "Oh, I nearly forgot. Augustus Fletcher asked me to remind you about your loan payment. Due next week, isn't it? He mentioned something about having to foreclose if you miss another installment." "I'm aware of my obligations," Garrett said. "Please thank Augustus for his concern. Would be a shame to lose this place after all the work you've put into it." Malcolm continued, his voice dripping false sympathy. "Though I'm sure with your medical skills you could establish yourself elsewhere easily enough. Assuming your reputation remained intact, of course." The threat lay barely concealed beneath his words. Abigail held her breath, waiting for Garrett's response. "Good day, Dr. Hewitt," Garrett said finally. "Safe journey back to town." The door opened, then closed. Through the crack in the doorframe, Abigail saw Garrett remain standing perfectly still until the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did his shoulders slump, the mask of composure slipping away to reveal the strain beneath. Abigail emerged from the bedroom, moving quietly to his side. "They suspect," she said softly. "Malcolm does," Garrett agreed. "The sheriff is less convinced, but Malcolm will work on him." He ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. "And Malcolm's right about one thing: the loan payment is due next week. $200 I don't have." "Because of me," Abigail said, guilt washing over her. "You could have had $3,000 if you'd turned me in." Garrett's eyes met hers, his gaze intense. "That was never an option." The conviction in his voice silenced her self-recrimination. Instead, she asked, "What will happen if you can't pay?" "Fletcher will start foreclosure proceedings. I'll have 30 days to vacate." Garrett moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered mountains that had been his refuge for 6 years. "Perhaps it's time anyway. This place has been more prison than home for too long." Abigail joined him at the window, her shoulder brushing his. "Where would you go? West, perhaps, like you." He glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "Though I suspect we'd make poor traveling companions, a fugitive and a disgraced doctor, both with prices on our heads." "I can think of worse companions," Abigail replied, returning his smile. The moment of lightness faded as Garrett turned serious again. "Malcolm won't let this rest. He's harbored a grudge against me since Antietam, and now he thinks he has leverage. We need to be prepared for him to act." "What can we do?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered their limited options. Finally he said, "I think it's time I spoke with Ezra Cooper. Really spoke with him about more than just traplines and weather. The blacksmith you mentioned, why him?" "Because Ezra was in Clearwater the night of the Ridgeline Bank robbery," Garrett replied. "And I believe he saw something he's been afraid to share all these years." Abigail studied his face, understanding dawning. "You think he can provide the evidence you need against Malcolm and Fletcher?" "It's possible. Ezra has always been cautious around Malcolm, more than professional courtesy would warrant." Garrett straightened, decision made. "I'll ride into town tomorrow. It's time to stop running and start fighting back." "I'm coming with you," Abigail said firmly. Garrett shook his head. "Too dangerous. Hayes may be gone, but others in town would recognize you." "I'll disguise myself," she countered. "Cut my hair, wear your clothes. From a distance I could pass for a young man." "Abigail, "I'm not staying here alone, waiting for Malcolm to return with a search party," she interrupted. "We face this together, or not at all." Their eyes locked in silent challenge, neither willing to yield. Finally, Garrett sighed, a reluctant smile tugging at his mouth. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Abigail Winters. Fortunate for both of us, wouldn't you say?" His smile deepened, reaching his eyes for the first time that day. "Indeed." As twilight settled over the mountain, they prepared for the journey ahead. Abigail sat before the fire while Garrett carefully cut her long, dark hair, the snip of scissors punctuating their quiet conversation as they refined their plan. Her severed locks fell to the floor, each cut symbolizing another step away from the woman she had been, another step toward whoever she was becoming. When he finished, she ran her fingers through the shortened strands that now barely reached her chin. The face that looked back at her from Garrett's small mirror was changed, harder perhaps, but also stronger. A face ready to stop running and start fighting back, just as Garrett had said. "What do you think?" she asked, turning to him. Garrett studied her, his expression unreadable. "You look different." "Beautiful," he said, simply, the word slipping out before he could reconsider. Color rose in Abigail's cheeks, but she held his gaze. "Thank you," she whispered. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, witnesses to the silent understanding growing between two souls who had found each other against impossible odds. Tomorrow would bring danger, confrontation, perhaps even answers. But tonight, in the warmth of the cabin surrounded by mountains and stars, they allowed themselves this moment of connection, fragile, unexpected, and all the more precious for it. Dawn broke cold and clear, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Garrett and Abigail set out early, both dressed warmly against the biting chill, their breath clouding in the still morning air. Abigail's transformation was remarkable, with her hair cropped short beneath a woolen cap, wearing Garrett's old clothes, and a pair of boots stuffed with rags to fit her smaller feet. She could easily pass for a young man at a distance. "Remember," Garrett said as they neared Coldridge, "keep your head down, speak as little as possible, and stay close. We go to Ezra's smithy first, then leave town immediately if there's any sign of trouble." Abigail nodded, adjusting the scarf that covered the lower half of her face. "I understand." The town appeared quiet as they rode in smoke rising lazily from chimneys, few people venturing out in the early morning cold. Garrett guided General through the snow-covered streets, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of danger. They passed the saloon, shuttered and silent. The general store, its windows frosted with elaborate ice patterns. The bank solid and imposing with its stone facade. The blacksmith shop stood at the far end of the main street, its forge already lit, orange light spilling from the open front onto the packed snow outside. Ezra Cooper moved about inside his powerful frame, silhouetted against the forge's glow. Garrett dismounted first, then helped Abigail down, maintaining the pretense that she was a young relative or apprentice. They approached the smithy, the warmth from the forge a welcome respite from the morning chill. "Morning, Ezra," Garrett called as they entered. The blacksmith looked up from the horseshoe he was shaping his weathered face, impassive. "Sullivan," he acknowledged with a nod, his gaze shifting briefly to Abigail. If he noticed anything unusual about Garrett's companion, he gave no indication. "What brings you to town this early?" "Need to speak with you," Garrett replied, keeping his voice low. "Privately." Ezra studied him for a moment, then set down his hammer. "Jacob," he called to a boy sweeping the far corner of the shop, "go fetch us some coffee from the boarding house. Take your time." The apprentice nodded and scurried off, clearly accustomed to following orders without question. When he was gone, Ezra gestured for Garrett and Abigail to follow him to a small room at the back of the smithy, a space that served as both office and living quarters. "Who's your friend?" Ezra asked once the door was closed. Abigail glanced at Garrett, who nodded slightly. She lowered the scarf, revealing her face. "Abigail Winters." Recognition flickered in Ezra's eyes. The woman Hayes was hunting. "Yes," she admitted. Ezra looked between them, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "Figured it was something like that when I saw Sullivan riding out with someone that day." He gestured to the room's 2 chairs. "Sit. Whatever brought you here must be important." They settled into the offered seats, while Ezra remained standing, his tall frame dominating the small space. Without preamble, Garrett said, "I need to know what you saw the night of the Ridgeline Bank robbery." The blacksmith went very still, his face betraying nothing. "What makes you think I saw anything?" "Because you were in Clearwater that night. I heard you mention it to Sheriff Grant once when you didn't know I was listening. And because, whenever Malcolm Hewitt or Augustus Fletcher comes near your shop, you find a reason to be elsewhere." Ezra was silent for a long moment, considering. Finally, he moved to a trunk in the corner, unlocked it with a key from around his neck, and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it, he extracted a pocket watch, not valuable in itself, but distinctive with its engraved pattern of crossed rifles. "Recognize this?" he asked, holding it out to Garrett. Garrett took the watch, examining it carefully. "No, should I?" "Belonged to Thomas Jenkins, head guard at the Ridgeline Bank. He always kept it in his left vest pocket. Said it was lucky, stopped a bullet during the war." Ezra's voice was flat, emotionless. "Didn't stop the knife that killed him, though." "You knew him," Abigail said softly. "Served together at Gettysburg." Ezra flexed his right hand, the missing fingers a permanent reminder of that bloody battle. "Good man. Didn't deserve to die face down in the mud outside that bank." "What happened?" Garrett pressed gently. Ezra took the watch back, his large fingers surprisingly delicate as he handled the timepiece. "I was in Clearwater delivering a special order set of decorative fireplace tools for the mayor. Finished late, decided to stay overnight rather than ride back in the dark. Was having a drink at the hotel bar when I heard the shots." He paused, his gaze distant as he recalled that night. "By the time I got outside, it was mostly over. 3 men on horseback riding hard out of town. One dropped something, this watch. I picked it up, intending to return it, but when I reached the bank..." He shook his head. "Jenkins and the other guard both dead. Money gone." "Did you see their faces, the robbers?" Abigail asked. "2 were masked. The third..." Ezra hesitated. "I caught a glimpse when he looked back. Just for a second, but enough." "Malcolm Hewitt," Garrett guessed. Ezra nodded once, his expression grim. "And I'm almost certain one of the others was Fletcher. Same build, same way of sitting a horse." "Why didn't you tell the sheriff?" Abigail questioned. "I tried," Ezra replied, a bitter edge entering his voice. "Next morning, I went to the Clearwater sheriff. While I was waiting to see him, Malcolm walked in, acting all concerned, offering to help treat the wounded. Sheriff treated him like a saint." He pocketed the watch. "When I finally got my turn, the sheriff made it clear he wasn't interested in accusations against a respected doctor from a one-handed blacksmith passing through town." "So you kept quiet," Garrett said, understanding rather than accusation in his tone. "What choice did I have? No one would believe me over Malcolm and Fletcher. Not without proof." Ezra's shoulders slumped slightly. "When I got back to Coldridge and found them both acting like nothing had happened, I knew they'd gotten away with it. I've kept my distance ever since." Abigail leaned forward, her expression intent. "But you kept the watch." "Why?" "Evidence, I suppose, though what good it does me I couldn't say." It proves nothing except that I was there. It might be enough, Garrett said thoughtfully. Combined with what I found in Malcolm's office, the maps, the schedules. If we take it all to Sheriff Grant, Grant won't move against Malcolm without absolute proof, Ezra interrupted. They've been friends for years, and Fletcher practically owns this town. Then we need more, Garrett insisted. There must be something that links them directly to the robbery. Ezra considered this, then said slowly, There might be. The money was never recovered right, $20,000 according to the newspaper. Too much to spend without raising suspicions in a small town. They'd have hidden it, Abigail suggested. Somewhere safe. Fletcher's bank, Garrett said suddenly. It would be the perfect hiding place. Who would look for stolen money in another bank? In plain sight, Ezra agreed. But how do you prove it? You can't exactly walk in and demand to search the vault. Before Garrett could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices, the stamp of boots on packed snow horses whinnying in distress. Ezra moved to the small window, peering cautiously outside. Sheriff Grant, he reported grimly. And Malcolm. They're searching buildings down the street heading this way. Garrett joined him at the window, his jaw tightening as he watched the men methodically working their way through the town. They're looking for Abigail. You need to go, Ezra said, already moving toward the back door. There's a path behind the smithy that leads to the pine grove. From there you can circle back to the mountain trail without being seen. Abigail pulled her scarf back up, securing her cap. We can't leave yet. Not when we're so close to the truth. There's no time, Garrett said, urgently taking her arm. Malcolm won't stop until he finds you. We'll come back when it's safer. When will that be? She challenged. Tomorrow, next week, Malcolm knows we're on to him. He'll only become more dangerous. Ezra interrupted their debate. She's right, Sullivan. This might be your only chance, but you can't both stay. They're specifically looking for a woman. I'll go, Garrett decided. Abigail can hide here while I— No, Abigail said firmly. I'm the one with the price on my head. You stay with Ezra, work on gathering evidence. I'll lead them away from town, then circle back to the cabin. Absolutely not. Garrett's voice was steel. It's too dangerous. I've been evading hunters for months, she reminded him. And thanks to you, I'm better prepared than ever. I can do this, Garrett. Their eyes locked, a silent battle of wills. Abigail saw the moment Garrett realized she wouldn't be swayed. Resignation crossed his features, followed quickly by worry. Here, Ezra said, handing her a small revolver from a drawer. 6 shots. Make them count, if you need to. Abigail checked the weapon with practiced ease, then tucked it into her coat. Thank you. Abigail, Garrett's voice had softened, his concern evident. Be careful, please. I will, she promised. Then, impulsively, she reached up and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. Find the evidence. End this. Before he could respond, she slipped out the back door and was gone, a shadow moving swiftly between buildings toward the edge of town. Garrett stared after her, his expression a complex mixture of fear, admiration, and something deeper that Ezra recognized all too well. She's something special, the blacksmith observed quietly. Yes, Garrett agreed, still looking at the space where Abigail had vanished. She is. A sharp knock at the front of the smithy jolted them both back to the present danger. Sheriff Grant's voice carried clearly. Cooper, open up, need to speak with you. Ezra and Garrett exchanged a glance. Ready? The blacksmith asked. Garrett nodded, squaring his shoulders. Ready. Together, they moved to meet the sheriff and Malcolm Hewitt, their plan taking shape with each step. The time for hiding was over. Now was the time for truth, for justice, and perhaps Garrett thought fleetingly for redemption. Outside, Abigail made her way cautiously toward the edge of town, her heart pounding with fear and exhilaration. She paused behind the livery stable, watching a group of men led by Malcolm searching nearby buildings. Taking a deep breath, she deliberately stepped into view, just long enough to be noticed, then darted away toward the pine grove. A shout went up behind her. "There! By the stables!" Boots pounded in the snow, pursuing her. Abigail ran faster, her shortened hair whipping in the winter wind. The weight of Ezra's revolver pressed against her side, a reminder of what was at stake. She would not be captured, not now, not when they were so close to uncovering the truth. As she reached the shelter of the pines, she glanced back at Coldridge one last time. Somewhere in that collection of weathered buildings, Garrett Sullivan was fighting his own battle, not just for her, but for the justice he had been seeking for 5 long years. "Be safe," she whispered into the cold air, then turned and disappeared into the forest, drawing the danger away from the man who had risked everything to save her. The cold bit into Abigail's lungs as she ran weaving between snow-laden pines, her boots finding purchase on the frozen ground. Behind her, voices called to each other, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as she put distance between herself and Coldridge. She had successfully drawn Malcolm and most of his search party away from town, giving Garrett and Ezra the opportunity they needed. Now, she just needed to evade capture long enough to circle back to the cabin where she and Garrett had agreed to rendezvous regardless of how events unfolded. The forest grew denser, the trees closing around her like silent sentinels. Abigail slowed her pace, conserving energy, listening intently for signs of followers. The voices had faded entirely now, but she knew better than to assume safety too soon. Malcolm would not give up easily, not when he believed capturing her would give him leverage over Garrett. As she paused to catch her breath, leaning against a massive pine, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed through the trees. Abigail froze her heart, stuttering. The shot had come from the direction of town, not from her pursuers. Garrett. Was he in danger? Had their plan gone wrong? Every instinct urged her to turn back, to run toward the sound, rather than away from it. But reason prevailed. Returning to Coldridge now would only endanger them both. She had to trust that Garrett could handle whatever situation had arisen. They had agreed on the cabin as their meeting place, and that's where she needed to go. With renewed determination, Abigail continued through the forest, using the skills Garrett had taught her over the past weeks. She moved carefully, leaving minimal tracks, using streams where possible to obscure her trail. The winter sun climbed higher, casting dappled shadows through the evergreen canopy as she made her way steadily toward the mountain trail that would lead her back to Garrett's cabin. By mid-afternoon, she had reached familiar territory, a ridge overlooking the valley where Coldridge nestled, smoke rising from chimneys into the clear blue sky. From this distance, the town seemed peaceful, showing no signs of the drama that had unfolded that morning. Abigail scanned the streets, hoping for some glimpse of Garrett, but the figures moving about were too small to identify. Turning away, she continued along the ridge toward the cabin trail. The day was waning, shadows lengthening as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Abigail quickened her pace, wanting to reach the cabin before full darkness. Garrett had shown her how to navigate by stars, but she preferred not to test those skills, if avoidable. As she rounded the final bend in the trail, the familiar outline of the cabin came into view, and with it, a plume of thick black smoke. Abigail stopped abruptly, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Fire. The cabin was on fire. Breaking into a run, she crested the rise and saw the full devastation. Flames engulfed the small structure, leaping hungrily from the roof to the adjoining stable. The heat was intense, even from a distance, the roar of the fire drowning out her cry of dismay. "Garrett," she called, approaching as close as the searing heat would allow. "Garrett." Only the crackling of flames answered her. Abigail circled desperately, searching for any sign of him. General tethered nearby equipment salvaged from the cabin, anything to indicate he had escaped the inferno. But there was nothing. A terrible thought struck her. What if he was inside? What if Malcolm had followed him back to the cabin, confronted him, left him to burn? The image was too horrific to contemplate, yet it forced its way into her mind, bringing with it a wave of nausea and despair. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched their sanctuary reduced to ash and embers. "Please, no." There was nothing she could do. The fire had advanced too far for any rescue attempt, the structure already collapsing in on itself in a shower of sparks. Abigail sank to her knees in the snow. The revolver Ezra had given her clutched uselessly in her hand as she watched everything burn. Night fell, the fire gradually subsiding to a smoldering ruin outlined against the star-filled sky. Abigail remained unable to leave, clinging to the desperate hope that Garrett might still appear. The temperature dropped sharply, but she barely noticed, grief and fear numbing her to physical discomfort. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats that finally roused her from her vigil. Quickly, she retreated to the shelter of nearby pines, drawing the revolver and waiting, her heart pounding. If Malcolm or Hayes had returned to confirm their destruction, they would find her ready. A lone rider appeared in the moonlight, approaching the still-smoking ruins cautiously. Abigail raised the gun finger, poised on the trigger, then lowered it immediately, a sob of relief escaping her lips. "Garrett," she breathed, emerging from her hiding place. He dismounted quickly, crossing the distance between them in long strides. Without hesitation, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, as if afraid she might disappear. "Thank God," he murmured into her hair. "When I saw the smoke, I thought you were inside." Abigail interrupted, her voice breaking. "I thought I'd lost you." Garrett pulled back slightly, his hands coming up to frame her face, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight. "I'm here," he said simply. "We're both here." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the shared fear of loss making this reunion all the more precious. Then Garrett's gaze shifted to the destroyed cabin, his expression hardening. "Hayes," he said grimly, "must have circled back, found the cabin empty." "How do you know it was Hayes?" "Because Malcolm was in custody when I left town," Garrett replied, surprising her. "He and Fletcher both." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. What happened? Leading her to a fallen log, where they could sit, yet still benefit from the residual warmth of the fire, Garrett recounted the events in Coldridge. After Abigail's departure, he and Ezra had confronted Sheriff Grant with their suspicions, presenting the watch and the evidence Garrett had gathered over years. Initially skeptical, Grant had agreed to question Malcolm and Fletcher separately. "Fletcher broke first," Garrett said, satisfaction evident in his voice, despite their current circumstances. When Grant mentioned specific details about the robbery that weren't in the newspapers, details only Ezra could have provided as a witness, Fletcher panicked. Tried to blame everything on Malcolm. And Malcolm denied it all at first. But when Fletcher's confession was read to him, he lost control. Started shouting that Fletcher had no right to implicate him, that the plan had been perfect until Fletcher got greedy. Garrett shook his head. Sealed his own fate with that outburst. "So it's over," Abigail said wonderingly. "They'll be tried for the robbery, for murder." "Yes, Grant was telegraphing the federal marshal when I left town." They'll be transferred to the territorial prison until trial. Garrett's expression clouded. But that still leaves Hayes. And Vincent Raymond's bounty on your head. Abigail leaned against him, suddenly exhausted. The emotional toll of the day, fear, desperation, grief, relief, had drained her completely. What do we do now? Where do we go? Garrett put his arm around her, drawing her closer into his warmth. I managed to retrieve some supplies from the smithy before riding out food, blankets, basic tools, enough to see us through a few days. He looked up at the star-filled sky, considering their options. There's an old line shack about 5 miles north. Trappers use it sometimes, but it should be empty this time of year. We can shelter there tonight, decide our next move in the morning. And after that, Abigail asked quietly, what happens to us? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither had fully articulated before. Garrett was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving from the ruined cabin to Abigail's face, illuminated by moonlight and the fading glow of embers. I don't know, he admitted finally. But whatever comes next, we face it together. If you want to. Abigail studied him, this man who had saved her life, taught her to survive, shown her what true strength looked like. A man who carried deep wounds yet still found the capacity for kindness, for justice, for hope. In the midst of loss and uncertainty, one thing had become absolutely clear to her. I want to, she said simply. Garrett's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. The gesture contained no grand declarations, no promises beyond the moment, yet somehow conveyed everything that needed saying. They sat together for a while longer, watching as the last flames flickered out, leaving only glowing coals where a home had once stood. Then wordlessly they rose and mounted general together. Abigail seated behind Garrett, her arms around his waist, as they rode away from the ruins toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the mountains stood silent witness to endings and beginnings, to destruction and hope. And above the same stars that had watched over them on that quiet night on the porch, continued their eternal vigil, indifferent to the small dramas of human lives, yet somehow offering solace by their very constancy. As they disappeared into the night, the only sign of their passage was a trail of hoofprints in the snow, soon to be covered by new snowfall, as winter continued its patient reclamation of the mountain wilderness. Dawn broke over the mountains, pale light filtering through the single grimy window of the line shack where Garrett and Abigail had spent the night. The crude shelter, little more than 4 walls, a roof, and a small iron stove, had provided basic protection from the elements, but little comfort. They had huddled together beneath blankets salvaged from Ezra's smithy, sharing warmth, as the temperature dropped to bitter cold. Abigail stirred first, her body stiff from sleeping on the hard-packed earthen floor. Beside her, Garrett slept fitfully, his brow furrowed even in rest. She watched him for a moment, noting the new lines of strain etched around his eyes, the silver threading more prominently through his dark hair. The events of the past day had taken a toll on them both. Rising quietly, she added kindling to the embers in the stove and coaxed them back to life. The small flame provided minimal heat, but cast a warm glow that pushed back against the gray morning light. Outside, a fresh layer of snow had fallen during the night, transforming the wilderness into an untouched expanse of white. When Garrett woke a short time later, Abigail had heated coffee in a battered tin pot found hanging on the shack's wall. The strong, bitter brew was a poor substitute for a proper breakfast, but they sipped it gratefully, huddled close to the stove as they assessed their situation. We have enough provisions for 2, maybe 3 days, Garrett said, taking stock of their meager supplies. After that, we'll need to hunt or find a town. Abigail nodded, cupping her hands around the tin mug for warmth. What about Hayes? If he burned the cabin, he must still be searching for me. For us, Garrett corrected. I doubt he'll distinguish between us now. Not after Malcolm's capture. He stared into his coffee, his expression troubled. Hayes isn't my primary concern, though. Vincent Raymond, Abigail guessed. Yes, as long as his bounty stands, you'll never be truly free. Any bounty hunter could pick up where Hayes left off. Garrett met her eyes, his gaze steady. We need to address the source of the problem. How Vincent has influence money connections. My word against his means nothing. Perhaps not alone, Garrett agreed. But combined with evidence of his family's other wrongdoings, that might be enough to force a reckoning. Abigail set down her mug, studying him intently. What are you suggesting? I think it's time we stopped running and started fighting back. Not just against Hayes or Malcolm, but against the Raymonds themselves. Garrett's voice hardened with resolve. If Vincent wants to find you so badly, perhaps we should accommodate him on our terms, not his. You want to confront him? Abigail asked incredulously. That's suicide. Not confrontation. Exposure. Garrett leaned forward, warming to his idea. The evidence you gathered about their land swindles, combined with what Ezra and I uncovered about Malcolm's crimes, it paints a picture of corruption that extends beyond one family. If we could present this to a federal judge, someone beyond local influence— You're talking about going to Cheyenne, Abigail realized. To the territorial court. Garrett nodded. Judge Weber has a reputation for impartiality. If we could reach him, present our case— It's a journey of over 100 miles in winter, Abigail reminded him. Across open territory where Hayes or other bounty hunters could easily find us. True, but we have one advantage they don't expect. They think we're still hiding, still running. Garrett's eyes held a new determination. No one would anticipate us heading straight toward authority. Abigail considered this, turning the dangerous proposal over in her mind. The idea was audacious, perhaps even reckless. Yet continuing to hide, to flee from town to town, always looking over their shoulders, that was no life at all. And despite the risks, the prospect of finally confronting the source of her troubles, of reclaiming her name and future, held undeniable appeal. What about your evidence against Malcolm and Fletcher? She asked. Sheriff Grant has that now. Not all of it, Garrett replied, reaching into his coat to withdraw a folded sheaf of papers. I kept copies of the most damning documents, including a letter from Fletcher to Malcolm discussing the division of the stolen money. It mentions the Raymonds' financial backing for some of their schemes. Abigail's eyes widened. The Raymonds were involved in the bank robbery too. Not directly, but they provided capital for Fletcher's bank after the Clearwater heist. I doubt it's coincidence. Garrett refolded the papers carefully. Money connects everything. The Raymonds, Fletcher, Malcolm. Follow the money, and you find the truth. They fell silent, both contemplating the dangerous path Garrett had proposed. Outside wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of another storm. Time was not their ally. Winter in Wyoming was unforgiving, and their supplies were limited. If we do this, Abigail said finally, we need a plan. Not just for reaching Cheyenne, but for what happens if we encounter Hayes on the way. Garrett nodded, spreading a crude map on the floor between them. There are 3 main routes to consider. They spent the morning planning their journey, weighing routes against risks, identifying possible shelter points along the way. By midday, a strategy had taken shape. They would travel south first, away from the obvious path to Cheyenne, before turning east through less frequented mountain passes. The journey would be longer, more arduous, but potentially safer from pursuit. As they packed their meager belongings, preparing to leave the relative security of the line shack, Abigail paused, her hand resting on Ezra's revolver. "Garrett," she said quietly, "if we succeed, if we clear my name, what then? For you, I mean." He looked up, caught off guard by the question. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "Haven't you?" Her gaze was steady, searching. "Your cabin is gone. Your life here destroyed. Even if we succeed, you can't return to what was." "No," he acknowledged. "But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing. That cabin was as much prison as sanctuary. And when this is over," Garrett hesitated, understanding the question beneath her words. "What of us? What becomes of this connection forged in danger and necessity when those pressures lift?" "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I only know I'm not the same man who found you in Coldridge. Whatever comes next, I can't return to the solitude I once thought was all I deserved." It wasn't a declaration of love, nor a promise of a shared future. Yet in his measured words, Abigail heard something equally meaningful, the acknowledgement of change, of growth, of possibility. For now, it was enough. They emerged from the line shack into the crystalline cold of midday, the sun bright overhead, despite the chill. General whickered softly in greeting, having been sheltered overnight beneath a crude lean-to adjacent to the shack. Garrett checked the horse's legs and hooves carefully before saddling him, knowing they would depend heavily on the animal's strength and endurance in the days ahead. "We'll need to ride double," he said, securing their supplies. "It will slow us down, but we don't have time to find another mount." Abigail nodded, pulling her cap lower and wrapping the scarf around her face. With her hair still short-dressed in Garrett's clothes, she maintained the appearance of a young man, a precaution they agreed to continue. Two men traveling together would draw less attention than a man and woman, particularly with a bounty out for a female fugitive. As Garrett helped her mount, their hands met briefly, a subtle reassurance passing between them. Then he swung up behind her, taking the reins, and with a gentle nudge to General's flanks, they set off toward the south, leaving the line shack and the ashes of Garrett's former life behind. Neither looked back as they descended into the valley, the mountains rising like silent guardians around them. Their path led through dense forest, at first snow-laden branches forming a cathedral of white above their heads. The only sounds were General's steady breathing, the creak of the saddle, and the soft fall of hooves in fresh powder. By mid-afternoon they had covered nearly 10 miles, the forest beginning to thin as they approached a high ridge overlooking a sweeping valley. Garrett halted General in the shelter of the trees, surveying the open terrain before them. The valley stretched for miles, a blank canvas of unbroken snow offering no cover whatsoever. "We'll need to cross before nightfall," he said, studying the position of the sun. "Too exposed to camp here." Abigail nodded her agreement, her breath frosting in the air. "How far to the next forest cover?" "About 3 miles. If we push General, we can make it in an hour." They continued onward, emerging from the protective embrace of the forest onto the exposed ridge. Wind whipped across the open expanse, carrying particles of snow that stung their faces despite the protection of scarves. General lowered his head against the blast, moving steadily forward under Garrett's guidance. Halfway across the valley, Abigail tensed suddenly, her body going rigid against Garrett's. "What is it?" he asked, immediately alert. "There." She pointed toward a distant line of trees at the valley's eastern edge. "Movement. Riders." Garrett squinted against the glare of sun on snow, his heart sinking as he made out the silhouettes of horsemen, 3, perhaps 4, emerging from the forest nearly a mile away. At this distance, details were impossible to discern, but one fact was clear: the riders were heading directly toward them. "Could be trappers," Garrett suggested, though he didn't believe it. "Or Hayes," Abigail replied grimly. "With reinforcements." They had no choice but to continue forward. Turning back would only lead their pursuers into the forest they had just left, eliminating any head start they might have. Garrett urged General to a faster pace, though he was careful not to push the horse too hard. They would need his strength for what promised to be a long chase. "If we can reach the southern forest," Garrett said, "we might lose them among the trees." Abigail nodded, her body tense with the effort of scanning their surroundings for any advantage. The distant riders had clearly spotted them now, their pace quickening noticeably. "They're gaining," she observed, her voice steady despite the danger. Garrett pressed his heels into General's flanks, silently urging the loyal animal to greater speed. The horse responded valiantly, breaking into a canter despite the deep snow and double burden. The edge of the forest grew tantalizingly closer, dark pines standing in stark relief against the white landscape. A sharp crack split the air, followed by the distinctive whine of a bullet passing overhead. Abigail ducked instinctively, Garrett's arm tightening protectively around her waist. "They're shooting at us," she stated, unnecessarily reaching for Ezra's revolver. "Save your ammunition," Garrett advised. "We're still beyond accurate pistol range. They're just trying to frighten us into stopping." Another shot rang out, this one coming closer, kicking up snow, mere yards to their right. General snorted in alarm, but maintained his pace, seeming to understand the urgency of their situation. The edge of the forest loomed nearer now, perhaps a quarter-mile away. Behind them, the pursuing riders had closed the distance to less than half a mile, close enough that Garrett could make out details, 4 men heavily armed with Hayes's distinctive figure in the lead. "Almost there." Garrett encouraged both to Abigail and to General, who was beginning to show signs of fatigue, his breathing labored, foam flecking his bit. They reached the tree line moments later, plunging gratefully into the shelter of the pines. Garrett immediately guided General onto a narrow game trail that wound between the trees, more difficult for pursuers to follow. They pushed deeper into the forest, the sounds of Hayes and his men crashing through the undergrowth behind them, growing temporarily fainter. "We can't outrun them forever," Abigail said, her voice pitched low to avoid carrying in the still forest air. "General is tiring and they have fresh horses." Garrett knew she was right. Already the horse's stride was shortening, his powerful muscles trembling with exertion. They needed a strategy beyond simple flight. "There," he said suddenly, pointing to where the trail diverged. "Take the right fork. I have an idea." They followed the narrower path, winding through increasingly dense forest, until they came to a small clearing dominated by a massive fallen pine. Its trunk, nearly 5 feet in diameter, had created a natural barricade with its upturned root system, forming a crude wall at one end of the clearing. Garrett dismounted quickly, then helped Abigail down. "Get behind the trunk," he instructed, unslinging the rifle from his back. "We make our stand here." Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. They had reached the limit of flight, and now must fight. She positioned herself behind the fallen tree, Ezra's revolver steady in her hand, while Garrett secured General to a nearby sapling out of the direct line of fire. "How many shots do you have?" he asked, joining her behind their makeshift fortification. "6 in the revolver," Abigail replied. "No additional ammunition." Garrett checked his own weapons, the rifle fully loaded with 8 rounds, and his revolver with another 6. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, but perhaps sufficient to convince Hayes that his quarry wasn't worth the cost. "We don't shoot unless absolutely necessary," he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Hayes wants to take you alive. The bounty specifies it. That gives us an advantage. He'll hesitate where we won't." Abigail nodded, her expression resolute. They could hear their pursuers now, the sounds of horses and men moving through the forest, drawing inexorably closer. Garrett positioned himself slightly to her left, rifle braced against the fallen trunk, its barrel pointed toward the path they had just traveled. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the trail, "know that I don't regret any of it. Finding you, helping you." Abigail's hand found his briefly, a fleeting touch that conveyed more than words could. "Nor do I," she replied simply. The moment of connection was interrupted by the appearance of the first rider at the edge of the clearing. Hayes reined in sharply, raising his hand to halt the men behind him. His weathered face showed surprise, then grudging respect, as he assessed the defensive position Garrett and Abigail had established. "Well now," he called, keeping his horse well back from the direct line of fire. "Seems we've got ourselves a standoff, Dr. Sullivan." "It appears so," Garrett replied evenly, "though I'm curious why you've gone to such trouble, Hayes. The bank robbers are caught. Your job in Coldridge is finished." Hayes shrugged, seemingly unperturbed by the rifle aimed at his chest. "One job ends, another begins. Vincent Raymond's bounty on Miss Winters here still stands. 3,000 is 3,000, regardless of who's paying. And my cabin was burning it necessary. Unfortunate that," Hayes admitted without much regret. "But Miss Winters proved elusive. Thought perhaps she might return to her nest if she believed you were inside." A cold smile touched his lips. "Seems I was right about one thing, you two have become quite attached." Garrett kept his expression neutral, though anger simmered beneath his composed exterior. "I suggest you and your men turn around, Hayes. Miss Winters is no longer your concern." Hayes laughed, a harsh sound in the winter stillness. "Bold words from a man outgunned 4-2. Be reasonable, Sullivan. Hand over the woman, and you walk away unharmed. Keep this up, and neither of you leaves these mountains alive." "You need her alive for the bounty," Garrett reminded him. "Prefer it that way, sure," Hayes acknowledged. "But dead works, too, just pays less. My client was quite specific. He wants proof she can't testify against him one way or another." Abigail tensed beside Garrett, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Your client lied to you, Mr. Hayes. I'm not a thief or a murderer. I'm a witness to Vincent Raymond's crimes, land fraud, corruption, attempted assault." Hayes's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or calculation. "Not my concern, ma'am. I don't judge guilt, just deliver those who've got a price on their heads." "And if that price was placed unjustly," Garrett challenged, "if you're being used to silence an innocent witness rather than capture a criminal, as I said, not my concern." Hayes shifted slightly in his saddle, his hand moving casually toward his holster. "Now I'll ask one more time. Surrender the woman, or—" His words were cut short by the unexpected crack of a rifle, not from Garrett's position, but from somewhere to their left. One of Hayes's men cried out, clutching his arm, as blood blossomed against his coat sleeve. "Ambush!" another shouted, drawing his pistol and firing wildly into the surrounding forest. A second shot rang out, then a third coming from different positions around the clearing. Hayes cursed, wheeling his horse around, as another bullet kicked up snow near his mount's hooves. "Fall back," he ordered, retreating toward the trail. His men needed no encouragement, already turning their frightened horses away from the invisible attackers. Garrett and Abigail remained frozen behind their barricade, as surprised by this turn of events as Hayes. Within moments, the bounty hunters had disappeared back into the forest, the sounds of their retreat fading quickly. "What just happened?" Abigail whispered, her revolver still trained on the now empty clearing. Before Garrett could respond, a voice called from the trees to their left. "You can come out now. They're gone." Warily, Garrett raised his head above the fallen trunk rifle still at the ready. From 3 different positions around the clearing, figures emerged, men dressed in buckskins and heavy winter coats. rifles held casually but competently. Their leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and weathered face, stepped forward, his rifle resting across his shoulder. "Mighty dangerous country to be traveling through with bounty hunters on your trail," he observed dryly. Garrett stood slowly, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. "We're grateful for your assistance, but I have to ask, why help strangers against Hayes and his men?" The bearded man spat into the snow, his contempt evident. "Hayes has made himself unwelcome in these parts. Thinks a bounty hunter's badge gives him the right to act like judge, jury, and executioner." He extended a hand. "Joseph Blackburn. These are my brothers, Isaac and Thomas." "Garrett Sullivan," Garrett replied, shaking the offered hand. "And my companion, Ab." "Best not use real names just yet," Joseph interrupted, glancing at Abigail with knowing eyes that suggested her disguise hadn't fooled him. "Woods have ears even in winter." Abigail nodded gratefully, tucking Ezra's revolver back into her coat. "You two look like you could use a hot meal and a proper rest," Joseph continued. "Our cabin's about 3 miles from here. You're welcome to shelter there tonight. Let your horse recover." Garrett exchanged a glance with Abigail, silently conferring. The offer was tempting. They were exhausted, General was near collapse, and night would fall soon. Yet trusting strangers, even those who had just saved them, carried its own risks. "We're heading to Cheyenne," Garrett said, testing the waters. "Important business that can't wait." Joseph studied them thoughtfully, then nodded. "Cheyenne, Judge Weber's court, I'm guessing, given your situation. We can help you get there, know these mountains better than most, including paths Hayes wouldn't think to watch." Surprise registered on both Garrett and Abigail's faces. Joseph chuckled at their expressions. "Small communities talk," he explained. "Word travels about a woman with a bounty on her head, a doctor who chose to help her rather than claim the reward." He glanced around the darkening forest. "But this isn't the place for such discussions. Come. There's a storm brewing, and these mountains get mighty inhospitable after dark." Decision made, Garrett retrieved General, who had weathered the brief confrontation with remarkable composure. The tired horse followed willingly as they set off, guided by Joseph and his brothers, through the deepening forest as the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall. Behind them, the clearing returned to silence, the only evidence of the confrontation, a scattering of hoofprints and bullet holes in ancient pines, soon to be covered by fresh snow, erased as completely as if they had never been. The Blackburn cabin proved larger and more substantial than the line shack where Garrett and Abigail had spent the previous night. Built of sturdy logs, chinked with moss and clay, it nestled against a rocky outcropping that sheltered it from the worst of the mountain winds. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. As they approached, a woman appeared in the doorway, tall, straight-backed, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled into a severe bun. She surveyed the newcomers with sharp eyes, a shotgun held casually but unmistakably ready in her capable hands. "Brought company, Joe," she called, her gaze lingering on Abigail. "Travelers in need of shelter, Sarah," Joseph replied. Hayes and his boys were after them. The woman Sarah nodded once, lowering the shotgun. "Then they're welcome here. Hayes has been a thorn in these mountains too long." Inside the cabin was surprisingly spacious, with a main room dominated by a large stone fireplace and several smaller chambers visible through partially open doors. The air smelled of wood-smoked coffee and some savory stew bubbling in a pot hung over the fire. After weeks in Garrett's sparse cabin and a night in the crude line shack, it seemed positively luxurious. Sarah Blackburn, Joseph's wife of 30 years, as she later informed them, proved as practical and efficient as her appearance suggested. She settled Garrett and Abigail near the fire with bowls of venison stew and mugs of strong coffee liberally laced with whiskey, while Joseph and his brothers saw to General's care in the small stable adjacent to the cabin. Only when they had eaten and the hot drinks had begun to thaw the bone-deep chill did Sarah broach the subject of their presence in the mountains. "So," she said, settling into a chair across from them, her knitting needles clicking steadily, "you'll be the doctor and the schoolteacher Hayes has been hunting. The ones from Coldridge." Abigail tensed, but Garrett laid a reassuring hand on her arm. "News travels fast," he observed mildly. "Trappers came through 3 days ago," Sarah replied. "Said Malcolm Hewitt and Augustus Fletcher were arrested for a bank robbery from years back. Said a doctor and a woman with a bounty on her head were somehow involved." Her shrewd eyes assessed them. "Didn't mention you were heading to Cheyenne, though. That's new information." "We need to see Judge Weber," Abigail said, deciding that honesty was their best course with these people who had already demonstrated their opposition to Hayes. "I have evidence against the man who placed the bounty on me, Vincent Raymond. Evidence of land fraud and corruption." Joseph, who had returned from the stable, dropped into a chair beside his wife. "Raymond," he repeated, exchanging a significant glance with Sarah. "That name means something to you, too." "Vincent Raymond was James Raymond's younger brother," Garrett explained. "James was my friend. We served together in the war." "And died there," Joseph guessed, reading the shadow that crossed Garrett's face. "At Antietam. Yes." A silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the steady click of Sarah's knitting needles. Outside, the wind had risen, driving snow against the windows in tiny crystalline impacts. "The Raymonds have a long reach," Joseph said finally. "Even out here in the territories. Their money builds banks, railroads, buys politicians." He studied Garrett intently. "You sure you want to challenge such power?" "We have no choice," Abigail replied before Garrett could. "As long as Vincent's bounty stands, I'll never be free. And the Raymonds will continue to steal land from people who can't defend themselves to corrupt officials who should uphold the law." Sarah's needles stilled. What sort of land fraud? Abigail described what she had witnessed during her time with the Raymond family. Vincent's involvement in schemes to falsify land titles to intimidate small farmers and ranchers into selling at fractions of their property's worth to bribe officials who might interfere. As she spoke, she noticed the Blackburns exchanging glances filled with growing anger and recognition. "You've encountered this before," she realized, pausing in her narrative. Joseph nodded grimly. "3 years ago, our neighbors to the east, the Wilsons, family of former slaves who'd built a good cattle operation. Suddenly, some Eastern company claimed to own their land, produced papers showing the Wilsons were squatting illegally. Sheriff came, forced them out at gunpoint. The company was a Raymond subsidiary," Garrett guessed. "Didn't know it at the time," Joseph confirmed, "but it fits the pattern you're describing." "And it wasn't just the Wilsons," Sarah added, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "At least 5 families around these parts lost land the same way in the past few years. All to make way for the railroad coming through, or mines or timber operations. All traced back to Eastern money." "Raymond money," Abigail said softly. "Likely so." Joseph leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Which makes your journey to Cheyenne all the more important and all the more dangerous. If what you say is true, if you have real evidence that could implicate the Raymonds in these land grabs, they'll do anything to stop you reaching Judge Weber." "Hayes is just the first line of defense," Garrett agreed. "If he fails, they'll have others." Sarah set her knitting aside, decision made. "Then you'll need help getting to Cheyenne. Not just directions, but guides who know every trail and pass, who can anticipate where Hayes might set ambush." "We've already imposed on your hospitality," Garrett began, but Joseph waved away his protest. "This isn't about hospitality," the older man said firmly. "It's about justice. Too many good people have lost their land, their livelihoods, some even their lives, to these eastern vultures. If you have the means to expose them to stop them, then by God we'll see you safely to Cheyenne." His brothers, who had remained silent observers until now, nodded their agreement. Isaac, the younger of the two, spoke up. "I'll ride ahead at first light, scout the passes. Thomas knows a trapper's route that cuts 30 miles off the journey to Cheyenne rough country, but Hayes and his men won't think to watch it." "And I'll send word to others," Joseph added. "People who've been hurt by these land schemes, who have reason to help you and hinder Hayes. By tomorrow night, every friendly cabin and homestead between here and Cheyenne will know to watch for you to offer shelter if needed." Abigail glanced at Garrett, overwhelmed by this unexpected alliance. His expression mirrored her own surprise and gratitude. "Why would you risk so much for strangers?" Abigail asked softly. Sarah's weathered face softened slightly. "Because 30 years ago, when Joseph and I first came to these mountains, we were strangers too. Lost everything in a flood back east, arrived here with nothing but our wagon and the clothes on our backs. Would have died that first winter if not for the kindness of those already settled here." She picked up her knitting again, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. "In this country, you help where help's needed. Simple as that." Later settled in a small side room Sarah had prepared for them, Garrett and Abigail spoke in hushed tones about this dramatic turn in their fortunes. A proper bed with clean blankets, a hot meal in their bellies, and, most surprisingly, allies in their dangerous quest, all unexpected gifts in their darkest hour. "Do you trust them?" Abigail asked, seated on the edge of the bed, while Garrett checked that the room's single window was securely latched against the howling storm outside. "I think so," he replied, turning to face her. "They have their own reasons to oppose the Raymonds' reasons that align with ours. But leading us to Cheyenne, mobilizing others to help, it puts them at considerable risk." Garrett sat beside her, the bed frame creaking slightly under their combined weight. "Some injustices run so deep they compel action regardless of risk. The Blackburns have witnessed the systematic destruction of their community by powerful men who believe themselves beyond accountability. Our arrival offers hope of challenging that power." Abigail nodded slowly, understanding. "Like you when you chose to help me rather than collect the bounty. An injustice that compelled action." "Perhaps," Garrett acknowledged, "though my motivations weren't entirely altruistic." "No." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "When I saw you in Coldridge that day, wounded and desperate, something shifted inside me. For 6 years I'd been not living, just existing, punishing myself for failures real and imagined." His gaze met hers directly. "You gave me a reason to act, to care about something beyond my own guilt." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate somehow than physical touch. Abigail's hand found his in the dim light, their fingers intertwining naturally. "And now," she asked softly, "what compels you to continue knowing the dangers ahead?" Garrett was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle patterns on the back of her hand. "Now it's simpler," he finally said. "Now it's you." The words were quietly spoken, but carried the weight of profound truth. Abigail's breath caught as she recognized what he was offering, not just protection or partnership in their current quest, but something more enduring, more significant. A future beyond the immediate danger if they survived to claim it. "Garrett," she began, but found herself without adequate words to express the complex emotions his simple declaration had evoked. He smiled slightly, understanding her silence. You don't need to say anything. I just wanted you to know, before whatever happens tomorrow, that meeting you was the best thing that's occurred in my life for a very long time. In response, Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his, a kiss both tender and tentative, an acknowledgement of feelings too new and fragile to fully articulate. Garrett's free hand came up to cradle her face, his touch reverent, as he deepened the kiss slightly, then drew back, resting his forehead against hers. "We should rest," he murmured, though reluctance colored his tone. "Tomorrow will be demanding." "Yes," Abigail agreed, equally reluctant to break their newfound closeness. They settled side by side on the narrow bed, fully clothed against the chill that pervaded even this well-built cabin. Garrett's arm encircled Abigail's waist, drawing her against his chest in a protective embrace that offered warmth and comfort in equal measure. Outside, the storm raged, wind and snow battering the sturdy walls that sheltered them. Yet, within that small room, a different kind of storm had begun to subside. The isolation, fear, and uncertainty that had driven both Garrett and Abigail for so long, giving way to something quiet but powerful. Not quite peace, not with the dangers still facing them, but perhaps its precursor hope. As sleep claimed them, their breathing synchronized in the darkness, while beyond the cabin walls, unseen in the swirling snow, Isaac Blackburn departed on horseback. He rode into the teeth of the storm, carrying word to friends and allies across the territory, word of two travelers bearing crucial evidence of justice, long delayed, but perhaps finally within reach. Dawn broke clear and cold after the storm, revealing a landscape transformed. Snow lay deep across the mountains, pristine and untouched, except for the single trail of hoofprints leading away from the Blackburn cabin, Isaac's path from the previous night. The sky arched overhead in a vault of perfect blue, the air so crystalline that distant peaks seemed close enough to touch. Preparations began early. Sarah packed provisions while Joseph and Thomas readied the horses, General now rested and eager, plus two sturdy mountain ponies for themselves. Maps were consulted, routes, debated, contingencies planned for every conceivable obstacle between their current position and Cheyenne. The direct route would take 3 days in good weather, Joseph explained, tracing a line across the crude map spread on the table. But Hayes will expect that. Instead, we'll take the trapper's path through Cougar Pass, then follow Spirit Creek eastward. Rougher terrain, but it cuts around the main trails where ambush would be easy. How long? Garrett asked, studying the alternative route. 4 days, maybe 5, with the snow this deep, but safer. Abigail, who had maintained her disguise as a young man even within the cabin's walls, joined them at the table. What about Isaac? When will he rejoin us? He won't, Thomas replied, speaking up for the first time that morning. The youngest Blackburn brother was taciturn by nature, but observant, his eyes constantly moving, as if scanning for threats even in the safety of the cabin. Isaac's job is to spread word, then get to Cheyenne ahead of us. He'll alert Judge Weber to expect you. And ensure the judge understands the significance of your evidence, Joseph added. Weber's a good man, fair-minded, but he sees many cases. Yours needs priority. By mid-morning, they were ready to depart. Sarah embraced each of them, including Abigail, whom she had clearly identified as a woman, despite the male attire. "God go with you," she said simply, pressing a small bundle of extra food into Abigail's hands. "And come back to us when it's done. Our door is always open." The journey began auspiciously enough, their small party making good progress through forests so deep with snow that the horses sometimes sank to their knees, requiring frequent rest. Joseph led with Abigail and Garrett in the middle, and Thomas bringing up the rear, his rifle always at the ready as he scanned their back trail for signs of pursuit. They traveled in near silence, conserving energy in the thin mountain air, speaking only when necessary. By nightfall, they had covered perhaps 15 miles less than hoped, but respectable given the challenging conditions. They made camp in a sheltered ravine, building a small fire that would be invisible from any distance, taking turns at watch throughout the night. The second day brought them to Cougar Pass, a narrow defile between towering cliffs, where the wind howled ceaselessly, driving powdery snow into blinding clouds that reduced visibility to mere yards. They dismounted, leading the horses single file through the treacherous passage, each person connected to the next by a length of rope to prevent separation in the whiteout conditions. "Stay close to the left wall," Joseph shouted over the wind. "Right side drops 200 feet in places." It took hours to navigate the pass, each step deliberate in the face of the relentless gale that threatened to pluck them from the narrow trail. When they finally emerged on the eastern side, descending into the relative shelter of a pine forest, all four were exhausted, their faces raw from wind and ice. "We'll rest here," Joseph decided, indicating a dense stand of trees that offered protection from the still strong wind. "Push on at first light." That night, huddled close to their small fire, Garrett noticed Joseph and Thomas exchanging concerned glances. "What is it?" he asked quietly, while Abigail dozed against his shoulder, worn out by the day's exertion. Joseph hesitated, then nodded to Thomas, who slipped away into the darkness. "Might be nothing," the older man said. Thomas thought he saw smoke about 3 miles back just before we entered the pass. "Could be other travelers." "Or haze," Garrett concluded grimly. "Possibly. Thomas has gone to check. He can move through these forests like a ghost. If anyone's following, he'll find them." Thomas returned near midnight, materializing out of the darkness so suddenly that Garrett's hand moved instinctively to his revolver before recognizing the younger Blackburn. "Hayes," Thomas confirmed in his laconic way. "Him and 2 others, following our trail through the pass." "How far behind?" Joseph asked. 6-7 hours, moving slow because of the storm." Joseph nodded, decision already made. "We break camp now. Move under cover of darkness. The moon's bright enough to travel by." Despite their exhaustion, no one argued. Within minutes, the fire was extinguished. Gear, packed, horses saddled. They set off into the night, Joseph leading them along a barely discernible trail that wound through the forest and down toward the promised Spirit Creek. The third day dawned gray and threatening, heavy clouds building to the west as they pushed eastward, following the creek's meandering course through increasingly broken country. Twice they were forced to backtrack when the path ended at impassable rock faces or ravines too steep for the horses to navigate. Each delay chafed the knowledge of Hayes's pursuit, adding urgency to their already difficult journey. By mid-afternoon, fat snowflakes began to fall, reducing visibility and further slowing their progress. Joseph called a halt beneath an overhanging cliff that offered some protection from the intensifying storm. "We need to rethink our route," he said, consulting his map with a troubled expression. "This weather will make the next section impassable. Too many steep slopes. Too much risk of avalanche." "Alternatives?" Garrett asked, helping Abigail down from General, noting with concern how pale and drawn she looked after nearly 3 days of hard travel. Joseph traced a different path on the map. "We could divert south, follow the old stage road for a stretch. Adds miles, but avoids the worst terrain. And puts us on a more traveled route, where Hayes might have allies," Thomas pointed out, ever vigilant. "True," Joseph acknowledged, "but I don't see much choice with this storm building." The decision was made for them when a distant rumble echoed through the mountains, an avalanche triggered by the fresh snow falling on an already unstable slope. "South it is," Joseph said grimly. "We'll have to risk the stage road." They altered course, angling away from Spirit Creek toward the south, where the land gradually descended from the high mountains toward the rolling prairie. By nightfall, they had reached the old stage road, little more than a wider trail through the forest unused since the railroad had made such transportation obsolete in this part of the territory. Joseph located an abandoned way station, its roof partially collapsed, but its stone walls still sound enough to provide shelter for the night. Inside, they found evidence of recent occupation ashes in the fireplace, a broken lantern, scraps of food. Thomas investigated silently, then reported his findings. Trappers, most likely, passed through 2, maybe 3 days ago. They settled in gratefully, building a fire in the ancient hearth, spreading their bedrolls on the dusty floor. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly but steadily, adding another layer to the already deep accumulation. "How much farther to Cheyenne?" Abigail asked, accepting a cup of hot coffee from Joseph. 2 days, if the weather holds," he replied. "But this storm could slow us considerably." Garrett noticed Abigail's barely concealed dismay at this news. She was holding up remarkably well, given the arduous conditions, but exhaustion was taking its toll. Her face was drawn dark circles shadowing her eyes, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone conserving every ounce of strength. "You should rest," he said quietly, settling beside her near the fire. "I'll take first watch." She nodded, too tired to argue, and leaned against him briefly, her head resting on his shoulder in a gesture that had become natural over the past days. "Wake me for my turn," she murmured, though they both knew he wouldn't. Later, as Abigail slept, and Joseph and Thomas conversed in low tones across the fire, Garrett found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought him here. From respected Philadelphia physician, to traumatized war surgeon, to mountain recluse, to fugitive, each transformation seemingly ordained by forces beyond his control. Yet for the first time in years, he felt as though he was moving towards something rather than away, pursuing a future, rather than escaping a past. His gaze lingered on Abigail's sleeping form, on the strength and vulnerability so perfectly balanced in her face. Whatever happened in Cheyenne, whatever challenges still awaited them, he knew with absolute certainty that his life had been irrevocably altered by her presence in it. The isolation that had once seemed his only possible existence now felt like a prison he had willingly constructed, one from which she had helped him escape. Morning brought a brief respite from the snow, though heavy clouds still hung low over the mountains, promising more to come. They set out early, following the old stage road as it wound through gradually descending terrain. The forest began to thin, giving way to scattered groves interspersed with open meadows, blanketed in untouched white. By midday, they had reached a small settlement little more than a church, a general store, and a handful of cabins clustered around a crossroads. Hope Crossing announced a weathered sign at the edge of the hamlet. "We should stop," Joseph suggested. "Resupply, rest the horses. Isaac would have passed through here, might be word waiting." The settlement appeared quiet, smoke rising from only a few chimneys despite the hour. As they rode slowly down the single street, Garrett felt an inexplicable tension building, a prickling awareness that something was amiss. Beside him, Abigail straightened in her saddle, clearly sensing the same unnatural stillness. "Where is everyone?" she whispered. Joseph frowned his hand, moving casually toward his rifle. "Midday in weather like this, folks should be about their business." They halted before the general store, its windows dark, no sign of activity within. Thomas dismounted silently, moving to peer through the glass, then shook his head. "Empty. Looks like they left in a hurry. Goods still on the counter." "I don't like this," Joseph muttered, his experienced eyes scanning the deserted street. "We should—" His words were cut short by the sharp crack of a rifle. the bullet splintering the hitching post mere inches from where they sat astride their horses. Instantly, all four scattered seeking cover as more shots rang out from multiple directions. "Ambush!" Thomas shouted, diving behind a water trough as bullets kicked up snow around him. Garrett grabbed Abigail's arm, pulling her from her saddle and dragging her toward the shelter of the church's stone steps. General and the other horses, panicked by the gunfire, bolted down the street, disappearing around a bend. "Inside," Garrett urged, pushing the heavy church door open and bundling Abigail through, diving in after her as bullets thudded into the wooden door frame. The church interior was dim after the bright snowlight outside, but as their eyes adjusted, they saw they weren't alone. A man in clerical garb stood frozen beside the altar, a Bible in his hands, his expression shocked at their violent entrance. "What in heaven's name?" he began, but Garrett cut him off. "Down!" he ordered, pulling the minister to the floor as a bullet shattered one of the stained glass windows, sending colored shards cascading across the wooden pews. "How many?" Abigail gasped, crawling toward the meager cover offered by the altar. Garrett risked a glance through the window. "At least 6 that I can see. Hayes and his original men plus reinforcements." He turned to the minister, who was pale with fear but remarkably composed. "Is there another way out of here?" The clergyman nodded, pointing toward a small door behind the altar. "Through the vestry. Leads to the cemetery behind the church." "Where are Joseph and Thomas?" Abigail asked, her voice tight with concern for their guides. "Thomas made it to the store. Joseph—" Garrett hesitated. "I lost sight of him after the first shots." The minister's eyes widened. "Joseph Blackburn, he's with you. You know him?" Abigail asked. "Everyone in these parts knows the Blackburns." The minister rose cautiously to a crouch. "I'm Reverend Bennett, and if Joseph brought you here, you must be the ones Isaac spoke of, the witnesses against the Raymond land schemes." Garrett nodded, his attention divided between the conversation and the gunfire outside, which had settled into a sporadic rhythm, suggesting the attackers were conserving ammunition while maintaining their position. "Isaac passed through yesterday," Bennett continued. "Warned us you might come this way, that Hayes and his men were pursuing you." His expression darkened. "Most of the town evacuated this morning, women, children, anyone who couldn't fight. Those who remained are positioned in the buildings around the square, ready to help when you arrived." "That's why it seemed deserted," Abigail realized. "It was a trap, but for Hayes, not for us." A fresh volley of gunfire erupted outside, but from new positions, the surrounding buildings where apparently the armed citizens of Hope Crossing had been waiting. Through the window, Garrett saw several of Hayes's men scrambling for better cover as bullets pinged around them. "Your friends have good timing," he observed to Bennett. The Reverend permitted himself a small smile. "The Raymonds have been buying up land around here for months, forcing people out with forged deeds and corrupt officials. Isaac's news that someone was finally bringing evidence against them was all the motivation needed." And he gestured toward the vestry door. "Now shall we get you to safety before Hayes realizes he's the one who's been ambushed?" They followed Bennett through the vestry and out into the cemetery behind the church, where weathered headstones poked through the snow like ancient sentinels. The sound of gunfire continued from the front of the church, but their position remained secure for the moment. "There," Bennett pointed toward a stand of trees beyond the cemetery fence. "Joshua Wilson is waiting with horses. He'll guide you the rest of the way to Cheyenne." As if summoned by his name, a tall black man emerged from the trees, leading 3 saddled horses. His weathered face broke into a smile of recognition at the sight of Bennett. "Right on time, Reverend," he called softly, "though your friends brought more trouble than expected." Joshua, Bennett acknowledged, leading Garrett and Abigail toward the fence. Hayes, pinned down for now, Wilson replied. But he's got men circling around from the north. We need to move quickly. A shout from the direction of the church interrupted their exchange. All four turned to see Joseph Blackburn limping toward them, supported by Thomas Blood, staining the older man's trouser leg. "Joseph!" Abigail cried, rushing to help. "Just a graze," Joseph insisted, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Caught me crossing to the store." Thomas's expression was grim as he helped his brother toward the fence. "Hayes brought more men than we expected. At least 10, maybe 12. Some were waiting in town before we arrived. They knew we were coming." Garrett realized a cold feeling settling in his chest. "Someone betrayed us." Bennett shook his head. "Not from Hope Crossing. We've all suffered too much at Raymond's hands." "Doesn't matter now," Wilson interjected practically. "What matters is getting you to Cheyenne before Hayes regroups. These horses are fresh. They'll get you there by tomorrow night if you push hard." "You're not coming?" Abigail asked, helping Joseph onto one of the waiting mounts. Wilson shook his head. "My place is here. Hayes will be angry when he discovers you've slipped away. The town will need every defender." He pointed eastward. "Follow the creek bed for 5 miles, then cut southeast across the prairie. Stay away from the main trails. Isaac has friends watching for you along the way. They'll provide fresh horses if needed." Gunfire intensified from the direction of the town square, suggesting Hayes's men were making a concentrated effort to break through the defenders' positions. There was no time for extended farewells or gratitude. Garrett swung into the saddle of the horse Wilson indicated, while Thomas helped Abigail mount the third. "Godspeed," Bennett said, stepping back as they prepared to depart. "What you carry isn't just evidence, it's hope for all of us who've suffered under Raymond corruption." "We won't fail," Abigail promised, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. As they rode away from Hope Crossing, following Wilson's directions toward the creek bed, Garrett glanced back once at the small settlement where strangers had risked their lives to ensure their passage. Smoke now rose from several buildings, the pop of gunfire continuing unabated. He sent up a silent prayer for those they were leaving behind, even as he urged his horse to greater speed. Beside him, Abigail rode with determined focus, her face set in lines of resolve that spoke of a woman who would not be deterred from her purpose. Joseph, despite his wound, kept pace, his decades of mountain life evident in his ability to endure pain without complaint. "Cheyenne by tomorrow night," Garrett said, raising his voice to be heard over the pounding hooves. "If we can make it that far, this will all be over." "Yes," Abigail replied, though her expression suggested she understood, as did Garrett, that reaching Cheyenne was only the beginning of their challenge. Presenting their evidence, convincing a judge of its validity against the formidable resources and influence of the Raymond family, these hurdles still loomed ahead. Yet, as they left Hope Crossing behind, putting mile after mile between themselves and Hayes's thwarted ambush, a cautious optimism began to take root. They had survived pursuit across mountains in winter, confronted armed bounty hunters, found unexpected allies in their quest for justice. Perhaps, Garrett thought, as they rode eastward beneath clearing skies, perhaps they might actually succeed. Behind them, unnoticed as they focused on the path ahead, a lone rider emerged from the tree line watching their progress with calculating eyes. Unlike Hayes and his men trapped in the firefight at Hope Crossing, this pursuer had maintained his distance, waiting for precisely this opportunity. Now, as Garrett, Abigail, and Joseph disappeared over a rise, he urged his horse forward, following their trail at a measured pace. Daniel Hayes might have failed in his commission, but Vincent Raymond had not placed all his trust in one bounty hunter. This second tracker, more patient and more dangerous, would ensure that Abigail Winters never reached Cheyenne with her damning evidence, or if she did that, she would not live long enough to present it to Judge Weber.